All right, very good. All right, ladies and gents, this is part two of commentary on the Lex Fridman debate. If you haven't seen the debate, you are now seeing it here. We're going to skip a little bit because Sam and I covered a lot of the beginning of the podcast until an hour and 30. So we're now going to skip a little bit until October 7th. So if you're looking at the subject lines and you want to see where we are, we're starting at around 2 hours in, 2 hours and 7 minutes in, more or less, because we want to get into more of the current war as opposed to the history. That every part of this debate is important, but we want to really get into the meat and potatoes of what's going on right now as opposed to what happened back then. So without further ado, this is another episode of the Soothing Semantics podcast. I'm your host, Rafi Pinsky. Make sure to subscribe, like, share, leave your comments. Make sure to follow me at Rafi the Realtor on Instagram, where you can find everything in South Florida in terms of real estate. And I would love to help you. Sign up to my newsletter in the link in bio or reach out to me, whether you have my contact info or not. Very easy to reach me. You can send me a DM, text me, send me an email, and I'd love to help you. Without further ado, we have Sam Hyde, who has wrote all different kinds of articles. You can find him at, I'm pretty sure on Instagram. Let's see, you're Sam Hyde on Instagram. What's your exact handle?
Samuel Joshua Hyde.
Samuel Joshua Hyde. Let me quickly. So Samuel Joshua Hyde. So for whoever didn't listen to part one of this commentary, please go check that out first. And then come here for part two. We also did an episode prior to these two parts, so you can check that out as well. So follow him at Samuel Joshua Hyde on Instagram. He's a political researcher and writer based out of Tel Aviv, and you can go to his link in bio for his Substack, so you can see all of the incredible work he's done on the conflict and the geopolitics. Really an intelligent young man. I really am happy that you came and spent your precious time to have more conversation with me, man. Thank you.
I'm happy to be here. I'm excited for this part of the debate. We'll see where things go.
Indeed, and he also does a very good impression of Mr. Finkelstein.
Norman Finkelstein.
Dude, this is your time to shine, man. I'm excited.
It's gonna come out at some point, you know.
Oh,
he's quite a ludicrous human being, so we'll have fun with him.
All right, guys. We are ready to rock. We are going to begin 1, 2, 3.
Facts. Let's move to the modern day, and we'll return to history, maybe 67 and other important moments. But let's look to today, in the recent months, October 7th. Let me ask sort of a pointed question. Was October 7th attacks by Hamas on Israel genocidal? Was it an act of ethnic cleansing? Just so we lay out the moral calculus that we are engaged in. Maybe it was
the problem. Sure. The problem with October 7th is this: the Hamas fighters who invaded southern Israel were ordered to murder, rape, and do all the nasty things that they did, and they killed some 1,200 Israelis that day, and abducted them, as we know, something like 250 civilians, mostly civilians, also some soldiers, took them back to Gaza, dungeons in Gaza. But they were motivated not just by the words of their current leader in the Gaza Strip, but by their ideology, which is embedded in their charter from 1988, if I remember correctly. And that charter is genocidal. It says that the Jews must be eradicated, basically, from the land of Israel, from Palestine. The Jews are described there as sons of apes and pigs. The Jews are a base people, killers of prophets, and they should not exist in Palestine. It doesn't say that they necessarily should be murdered all around the world, the Hamas charter, but certainly the Jews should be eliminated from Palestine. And this is the driving ideology behind the massacre of the Jews on October 7th, which brought down on the Gaza Strip, and I think with the intention by the Hamas of the Israeli counteroffensive, because they knew that counteroffensive would result in...
Sam, just in case you didn't see your phone, just text me, stop or pause.
Yeah,
okay. Palestine.
You got it, okay.
Dead because the Hamas fighters and their weaponry and so on were embedded in the population in Gaza, and they hoped to benefit from this in the eyes of world public opinion as Israel chased these Hamas people and their ammunition dumps and so on, and killed lots of Palestinian civilians in the process. All of this was understood by Sinwar, by the head of the Hamas, and he strived for that. But initially, he wanted to kill as many Jews as he could in the border areas around the Gaza Strip.
I'll respond directly to the points you made, and then I'll leave it to Norm to bring in the historical context. That Hamas charter is from the 90s, I think?
1988.
1988, so it's from the 80s. I think your characterization of that charter as anti-Semitic is indisputable. Okay. I think your characterization of that charter as genocidal is off the mark.
It's implicit.
And more importantly, that charter has been superseded by a new charter. In fact, has
Wait. This is
Yeah.
there's a new charter. There's a new charter now. Wait a minute, guys. We changed our minds. Hamas doesn't want to kill all the Jews anymore. Just follow the new charter, because the new charter.
Well, yeah, it's not even that there's a new charter. There was, there was some sort of document, but the original charter remained almost constitutional to the organization, if I can put it that way. So it's not that the charter's been replaced. There were just certain things that were changed. But the mere fact that he doesn't think, the idea of Jews hiding behind rocks and trees, and even the rocks and trees cry out, "Oh, Jew, there's oh, Muslim, there's a Jew hiding behind me, come and kill him," that's not genocidal language. I'm not sure what is.
What is then, right? Yeah, the Garquois tree.
has been, well, there is
no new charter.
There is
an explanation, a statement they made in 2018, supposedly clarifying things which are in the charter, but it doesn't actually step back from what the charter says. Eliminate Israel, eliminate the Jews from the land of Israel.
In 2018, the Hamas charter, if we look at the current version of the charter,
it's not called a charter. You're calling it a charter. It wasn't. The only thing called the charter is what was issued in 1988 by Yassin himself.
Anyway, it makes a clear distinction between Jews and Zionists in 2018. Now, you can choose to dismiss it, believe it, it's sincere, it's insincere, whatever.
Insincere is probably the right word.
Secondly, I'm really unfamiliar with fighters who consult these kinds of documents before they go on.
In the kindergarten, they're told, kill the Jews. They practice with make-believe guns and uniforms when they're 5 years old in the kindergartens of the Hamas.
At the instruction of the Commissioner General of UNRWA, right?
I didn't say that. I said the Hamas has kindergartens and summer camps in which they train to kill Jews, children aged 5 and 6.
Secondly, you keep saying Jews, to which I would respond.
They use the word Jews.
To which I would respond that Hamas does not have a record of deliberately targeting Jews who are not Israelis. And in fact, it also doesn't have a record of deliberately targeting either Jews or Israelis outside Israel and Palestine. So, all this talk of...
unlike the Hezbollah, which has targeted Jews outside Palestine.
We're talking about October 7th and Hamas. If you'd also like to speak about Hezbollah, let's get to that separately, if you don't mind. So again, genocide, if that term is going to be discussed, my first response.
What's that noise?
Oh no, I was looking. Can you hear it?
Would be, let's talk about potentially genocidal actions against Israelis rather than against Jews for the reasons that I just mentioned. And again, I find this constant conflation of Jews, Israel, Zionism to be a bit disturbing. Secondly, I think there are quite a few indications in the factual record that raise serious questions about the accusations of the genocidal intent and genocidal practice of what happened on October 7th. And my final point would be, I don't think I should take your word for it. I don't think you should take my word for it. I think what we need here is a proper, independent, international investigation. And the reason we need that, of genocide during this conflict, whether by Palestinians on October 7th or Israel thereafter, the reason that we need such an investigation is because there won't be any hearings on what Hamas did on October 7th at the International Court of Justice, because the International Convention on the Prevention and Punishment of the Crime of Genocide deals only with states and not with movements. I think the International Criminal Court, and specifically its current prosecutor, Karim Khan, lacks any and all credibility. He's been an absolute failure at his job. He's just been sitting on his backside for years on this file. And I think I would point out that Hamas has called for independent investigations of all these allegations. Israel has categorically rejected any international investigation, of course, fully supported by the United States. And I think what is required is to have credible investigations of these things, because I don't think you're going to convince me. I don't think I'm going to convince you. And this is two people sitting across the table from each other.
There's certain things you don't even have to investigate. You know how many civilians died in the October 7th assault.
Yes, but that's not...
You know that there are lots of allegations of rape. I don't know how persuaded you are of those. They did find bodies without heads.
There were no Islamic.
There were some beheadings, apparently.
The Israelis didn't even claim that in the document they submitted before the ICJ. Go read what your government submitted. It never mentioned beheadings.
Well, as far as I know, some people were beheaded, but
they bring it up right now.
You also deny that there were rapes there.
I didn't deny. I said I've not seen convincing evidence that confirms it. I've said that from day one, and I'll say it today, 4.5 months later.
Do you know that they killed 800 or 900 civilians in that
Absolutely. That seems to me indisputable.
Oh, okay. Well,
yes,
I've said that from day one.
Well, to be clear, you haven't. You did a debate. I don't remember the talk show, but you seem to imply that there was a lot of crossfire and that it might have been the IDF.
I said that there is no question, because the names were published in Haaretz, there is no question that roughly of the 1,200 people killed, 800 of them were civilians. 850, fine. So I never said that, but then I said, no, we don't know exactly how they were killed, but 800 civilians killed, no, 850, no question there. And I also said, on repeated occasions, there cannot be any doubt, in my opinion, as of now, with the available evidence, that Hamas was responsible for significant atrocities, and I made sure to include the plural.
There's a lot of tricky language being employed here. Do you think it's 850?
It's called attaching value to words and not talking like a motor mouth. Okay. I am very careful about qualifying, because that's what language is about.
That's great. Then let me just ask a clarifying question. Do you firmly believe that the majority of the 850 civilians were killed by Hamas?
My view is, even if it were half, 400 is a huge number by any reckoning. It's
Okay, wait, you didn't.
I said
wait,
even
wait,
if
wait, wait,
because Professor Morris, I don't know. I agree with Moeen Rabbani. I'm not sure if he concedes the 400. I'll say because I have right as I said,
850
well,
slaughtered
because
by Hamas.
I don't know.
A couple of individuals were killed in this very action.
I don't know.
You're saying from
Professor
day one
Morris,
you believe this particular thing. You clearly don't. You clearly don't believe this
from
thing. You don't.
day one, I
You said people died. That's not controversial.
Wait, hold on.
That's not controversial.
Mr. Bennell, I attach value to words.
Yes, you said that.
When
You value them. You're talking so much.
Mr. Bennell, please slow down the speech and attempt to listen. When I was explicitly asked by Piers Morgan, I said there can be no question that Hamas committed atrocities
I've heard this,
on October 7th. If you want me to pin down a number, I can't do that.
And ask you to pin down a number. You can listen to them. No, my question is, I'll ask you a very precise
Sorry,
question.
excuse me.
It's a very easy
If I understood your question correctly.
My question is, do you think the majority of the people that were killed on October 7th, civilians, were killed by Hamas,
Yes.
or are we subscribing to the idea that the IDF killed hundreds,
No,
400 or 500?
no, but let me explain why that's a difficult question to answer. The total number of civilians killed was 800, 850. We know that Hamas is responsible probably for the majority of those killings. We also know that there were killings by Islamic Jihad. We also know...
We're bunching together the Islamic Jihad and Hamas. So that's
Well,
splitting hairs now. No, but he means the raiders. He means the raiders.
I'm speaking in opposition to the conspiracy theory that people like... Do you prefer Norm or Professor Finkelstein, or what do you? I don't know how you.
Well, it's not a conspiracy theory.
Well, the conspiracy theory is the idea that the IDF killed the majority of them.
It's not a conspiracy theory.
And there's also a theory that, as Norm pointed out on the show that he was on, that he thought that it was very strange that, given how reputable Israeli services are when it comes to sending ambulances, retrieving bodies, he thought it was very strange that that number was continually being adjusted.
And do you know
so
why?
when you say that in combination with, well, I'm not sure how many were killed.
Well, do you know why the number? Do you know why the number went down? The number went down because the Israeli authorities were in possession of 200 corpses that were burned to a crisp that they assumed were Israelis who had been killed on October 7th. They later determined that these were in fact Palestinian fighters. Now, how does a Palestinian fighter get burnt to a crisp?
No, you're mixing two things. Some of the bodies they weren't able to identify, and eventually they just ruled that some of them were actually Arab marauders rather than Israeli victims. A few of them also, of the Jews, were burnt to a crisp, and it took them time to work this out. And they came out initially with a slightly higher figure, 1,400 dead, and eventually reduced it to 1,200
and the reason
Israelis.
And the reason is that a proportion of Israeli civilians killed on October 7th, I don't believe it was a majority. We don't know how many. Some were killed in crossfire. Some were killed by Israeli shell fire, helicopter fire, and so on. And the majority were killed by Palestinians. And of that majority, we don't know. I mean, again, I understood your question is referring specifically to Hamas, which is why I tried to answer it that way. But if you meant generically Palestinians, yes. If you mean specifically Hamas, we don't have a clear breakdown of how many.
I don't mean specifically Hamas.
Okay.
But I just think when you use the word some, that's doing a lot of heavy lifting.
We'll use some.
That's fine, but some can mean anywhere from 1% to 49%.
But we don't know.
So the numbers here and the details are interesting and important almost from a legal perspective. But if we zoom out, the moral perspective, are Palestinians from Gaza justified in violent resistance?
Well, Palestinians have the right to resistance. That right includes the right to armed resistance. At the same time, armed resistance is subject to the laws of war. And there are very clear regulations that separate legitimate acts of armed resistance from acts of armed resistance that are not legitimate. And
the attacks of October 7th, where did they land for you?
There's been almost exclusive focus on the attacks on civilian population centers and the killings of civilians on October 7th. What is much less discussed, to the point of amnesia, is that there were very extensive attacks on Israeli military and intelligence facilities on October 7th. I would make a very clear distinction between those two. And secondly, I'm not sure that I would characterize the efforts by Palestinians on October 7th to seize Israeli territory and Israeli population centers as in and of themselves illegitimate.
You mean attacking Israeli civilians?
No, that's not what I said.
What you said.
I think what you had on October 7th was an effort by Hamas to seize Israeli territory and population
and
centers.
kill civilians.
That's not what I said. What I said is I think I would not describe the effort to seize Israeli territory as in and of itself illegitimate, as a separate issue from the killing of Israeli civilians, where in those cases where they had been deliberately targeted, that's very clearly illegitimate.
Whole families were slaughtered in kibbutzim.
But I'm making
many of them left-wingers, incidentally, who helped Palestinians go to hospitals in Israel and so on.
Again,
even drove Palestinian cancer patients to hospitals.
Again, I'm making a distinction.
But you don't seem to
here.
be very condemnatory of what the Hamas did.
Well, I don't do selective condemnation.
I'm not talking about selective.
I don't do selective
specific
outrage.
condemnation of this specific.
Well, you know what it is. You know,
I would, for example.
Don't you think it's so interesting? Because I'm almost sure that we'll get into the argument later about the Israeli military being in Gaza, and it's almost guaranteed this guy will call it ethnic cleansing. I mean, I watched this months ago when it came out, so I can't remember. But don't you think it's interesting that he says invading into another country, invading into another sovereign territory of another country and trying to seize territory and population centers is legitimate. Mm-hmm. Now, that's not his opinion on the West Bank. Why? If what I'm saying is, if that's legitimate to him according to the laws of war and to international law, it strikes me as odd, because I can almost guarantee you if Israel went and seized territory in Ramallah in the West Bank, the capital city of Palestine, that wouldn't be legitimate to him. So I think there's an interesting distinction to draw here in the sense of that there's absolutely nothing going on here where he's going to hold himself to any sort of standard. I think that's something we'll see going forward.
Yeah, well, I think the clear distinction is he's not necessarily supporting Hamas as a government, as a terrorist group, but he is not exactly against them taking territory from Israel because at the end of the day, he's on the other side. So I think
Yeah.
when we do it, when we do it, it's wrong. But when they do it, it's he may be in the way they did it, that's a problem. But I think deep down he isn't so unhappy about it. Maybe if they killed less civilians, but nonetheless, if they won some territory, permanently took some territory, it wouldn't have bothered Muin very much.
Yes.
Condemn Israeli assaults on civilians, deliberate assaults on civilians. I would condemn them, but you're not doing that.
You know,
with the Hamas.
you know what the issue is? I've been speaking in public now, I would say since the late 1980s and interviewed and so on. I've never on one occasion ever been asked to condemn any Israeli act. When I've been in group discussions, those supporting the Israeli action or perspective, I have never encountered an example where these individuals are asked to condemn what Israel is doing. The demand and obligation of condemnation is exclusively applied, in my personal experience over decades, is exclusively applied to Palestinians.
No,
And those,
Israel is condemned day and night on every television channel, on every, and has been for the
I'm
last
telling you
decades.
about personal experience lasting decades.
You said, quote.
Oh no.
I'm trying to quote what you just said.
I shouldn't have said anything at any point.
You said, Professor Morris,
Yes.
you just said, I would condemn
And I
anytime
have to.
Israel deliberately attacks civilians,
Yes.
okay? The problem, Professor Morris, is over and over again, you claim in the face of overwhelming evidence that they didn't attack civilians.
That's not true. I've said
Really?
Israel has attacked
Professor-
civilians.
Professor
In
Mar-
Kibya, Israel attacks
Right, right,
civilians.
Professor
And I've written
Morris.
extensively
Okay,
about
I know
that.
that.
In Kafr Qasim, they killed
Yes,
civilians. And I've
and now let's
So you're just
okay,
you're selecting.
okay,
You're cherry picking.
let's fast forward when you were in the dope. What did you say about the 1982 Lebanon War?
What did I say?
You don't remember? Okay, allow me.
Wow.
Okay, so it happens that I was not at all I had no interest in the Israel-Palestine conflict as a young man until the 1982 Lebanon War.
Yeah. Lost the passage.
I'll find it.
Okay, real quick, while he's searching for that,
Yeah, allow me.
you bring up something that's really important that a lot of people don't draw distinction between, in that there is just causes for war and there's just ways to act within a war. And these two things principally do have distinction from one another. However, while I appreciate the recognition of the distinction, the idea that the cause for war that Hamas was engaged in, I don't believe, if we look at their actions in war or the statements they've made, it doesn't seem like it had to do with territorial acquisition.
No. The point I was making was what was Hamas trying to achieve militarily on October 7th? And I was pointing out that the focus has been very much on Hamas attacks on civilians and atrocities and so on. And I'm not saying those things should be ignored. What I'm saying is that what's getting lost in the shuffle is that there were extensive attacks on military and intelligence facilities. And as far as let's say the other aspects are concerned, because I think either you or Lex asked me about the legitimacy of these attacks, I said I'm unclear whether efforts by Hamas to seize Israeli population centers in and of themselves are illegitimate, as opposed to actions that either deliberately targeted Israeli civilians or actions that should reasonably have been expected to result in the killings of Israeli civilians. Those strike me as by definition illegitimate. And I want to be very clear about that.
Illegitimate means you condemn them.
Illegitimate means they are not legitimate. I have a problem
Condemning your side, yes.
No, not condemning my side. I have a problem with selective outrage, and I have a problem with selective condemnation. And as I explained to you a few minutes ago, in my decades of appearing in public and being interviewed, I have never seen I've never been asked to condemn an Israeli action. I've never been asked for a moral judgment on an Israeli action. Exclusive request for condemnation has to do with what Palestinians do. And just as importantly, I'm sure if you watch BBC or CNN, when is the last time an Israeli spokesperson has been asked to condemn an Israeli act? I've never seen it.
I don't think we condemn the Arab side either, though, right? I don't think there's any condemnation.
No, but now that we're talking about Israeli victims, all of a sudden morality is
Well, I think the reason why it comes up is because there's no shortage of international condemnation for Israel. As Norman will point out a million times, that there are 50 billion UN resolutions, you've got Amnesty International, you've got multiple bodies of the UN, you've got now the case for the ICJ, so there's no question of if there's condemnation
But
for
sorry,
Israel.
if I can interrupt you. In 1948, the entire world stood behind the establishment of a Jewish state in the entire
No,
world.
except the Arab states and the Muslim states.
Well,
not the entire world.
Okay, but I think you know what I mean by that.
The Western democracies, that's what you're saying.
Well, then also
Western
my question-
democracies supported the establishment of Israel.
My question was, you said that you believe that this is very short. You think that there's an argument to be made that the people in Gaza, Hamas, and Islamic Jihad whoever participated had a just cause for war. Maybe they didn't do it in the correct way, but they maybe had a just cause for war.
I don't think there's a maybe there. The
Okay, you
Palestinians
think absolutely there's just cause for. Do you think that Israel has a just cause for Operation Swords of Iron?
No, of course not.
Okay, all right. You can say your phone.
Okay. First of all, on this issue of double standards, which is the one that irks or irritates Muin, you said that you are not a person of double standards, unlike people like Muin. You hold high a single standard, and you condemn deliberate Israeli attacks on
Civilians.
When they occurred,
civilians. And I would say that's true for the period up till 1967, and I think it's accurate, your account of the First Intifada. There, it seems to me, you were in conformity with most mainstream accounts. And in the case of the First Intifada, you also used, surprisingly, you used Arab human rights sources like Al-Haq, which I think Muin worked for during the First Intifada. That's true. But then something very strange happens. So let's illustrate it.
When does something strange happen? Is Arabs rejecting
Okay, right.
peace offers?
Well,
By accepting the Oslo agreements.
yeah.
Not the-
Okay. If we have time, I know the record very well. I'll be very happy to go through it with you. But let's get to those double standards. So this is what you have to say about Israel's invasion of Lebanon in 1982. You said Israel was reluctant to harm civilians, sought to avoid casualties on both sides, and took care not to harm Lebanese and Palestinian civilians. You then went on to acknowledge the massive use of IDF firepower against civilians during the siege of Beirut, which traumatized Israeli society, Mars quickly enters the caveat that Israel, quote, tried to pinpoint military targets, but inevitably many civilians were hit. That's your description of the Lebanon war. As I say, that's when I first got involved in the conflict. I am a voracious reader. I read everything on the Lebanon war. I would say there's not a single account of the Lebanon war in which the estimates are between 15 and 20,000 Palestinian and Lebanese were killed, overwhelmingly civilians, the biggest bloodletting until the current Gaza genocide, biggest bloodletting. I would say I can't think of a single mainstream account that remotely approximates what you just said. So, leaving aside, I can name the books, voluminous, huge volumes. I'll just take one example. Now, you will remember, because I think you served in Lebanon in 82, am I correct on that? Yeah. So you'll remember that Dov Yarmia kept a war diary. So, with your permission, allow me to describe what he wrote during his diary. So, he writes, the war machine of the IDF is galloping and trampling over the conquered territory, demonstrating a total insensitivity to the fate of the Arabs who are found in its path. A PLO-run hospital suffered a direct hit. Thousands of refugees are returning to the city. When they arrive at their homes, many of which have been destroyed or damaged, you hear their cries of pain and their howls over the deaths of their loved ones. The air is permeated with the smell of corpses, destruction and death. I continue. Does that sound like your description of the Lebanon war?
Forget my description.
Forget it?
The point you're
Words
making.
are in print. We cannot
Let me
forget them.
just finish my sentence. The point you're making, which you somehow forget, is that there are Israelis who strongly criticize their own side and describe how Israelis are doing things which they regard as immoral. You don't find that on the Arab side.
I'm talking about you, Mr. Morris. I'm not talking about Dev Yarmia. I'm talking about you, the historian. How did you depict the Lebanon war?
I believe that the Israeli military tried to avoid committing a civilian
So
casualty.
all the accounts by Robert Fisk and Pity the Nation. I know.
As always.
So that's why you can say with such confidence that you don't condemn deliberate Israeli attacks on civilians, because there weren't any.
No, I didn't say there weren't.
Yeah, you didn't.
You agreed that I have condemned Israeli attacks on civilians.
I never quarrel with facts. Your description of the 1982 war is so shocking it makes my innards writhe. And then your description of the Second Intifada. Your description of defensive shield, they are worse than apologetics. That's an astounding
destroying
falsification.
Jews in masses in buses and in restaurants. That's the Second Intifada. Do you remember that? Suicide bombers in Jerusalem's buses and restaurants.
I am completely aware of that. But if you forgot the numbers, it was 3 to 1. The number
killed mostly armed Palestinian gunmen.
That's what you say in your book, but that's not what Amnesty International said. That's not what Human Rights Watch said. That's not what I do. That's not what Gaza said. Listen.
In the Second Intifada, some 4,000 Palestinians were killed. Most of them armed people, and the Israelis, thousands of Israelis were killed. Almost all of them civilians.
Professor Morris, fantasy, but I'm not going to argue with here. Here's a simple challenge. You said not to look at the camera. Scares the people. I'll make the open challenge.
You are going to them.
No, Professor Morris.
Open challenge.
Words are in print. I wrote 50 pages analyzing all of your work. I quote, some will say cherry pick, but I think accurately quote you. Here's a simple challenge.
Oh, wait. What did I do? Open.
To answer it that way. But if you meant generically Palestinians, yes. If you mean specifically Hamas,
Oh, we're much forward. Yeah.
Where I misrepresented,
Send me the article.
fine, and then we can have a civil, scholarly discussion.
I'm not sure we will agree.
We don't have to agree. It's for the reader to decide, looking at both sides, where does truth stand.
No, and if I may ask, it's good to discuss ideas that are in the air now as opposed to citing literature that was written in the past as much as possible, because listeners were not familiar with the literature. So, like, whatever was written, just express it, condense the key idea, and then we can debate the ideas.
No, there are two aspects. There's a public debate, but there's also written words.
Yes, I'm just telling you that you, as an academic historian, put a lot of value in the written word, and I think it is valuable. But in this context,
He's not the only historian who puts value to words. I also do, actually.
Yes. But
just 1 or 2 sentences at a time.
But this in this context, just for the educational purpose,
The
teaching
educational
people.
purpose is, why would people commit what I have to acknowledge, because I am faithful to the facts, massive atrocities on October 7th? Why did that happen? And I think that's the problem. The past is erased, and we suddenly went from 1948 to October 7th, 2023. And there's a problem there.
So first of all, you have complete freedom to backtrack, and we'll go there with you. Obviously, we can't cover every single year, every single event, but there's probably critical moments in time.
Can I respond to something relating to that Lebanon war? I looked at the book that he got this from, where the quote was from. It sounds cold to say it, but war is tragic and civilians die. There is no war that this has not happened in the history of all of humankind. The statement that Israel might take care not to target civilians is not incompatible with a diary entry from someone who said they saw civilians getting killed. I think that sometimes we do a lot of weird games when we talk about international humanitarian law or laws that govern conflict, where we say things like civilians dying is a war crime, or civilian homes or hospitals getting destroyed is necessarily a war crime, or is necessarily somebody intentionally targeting civilians without making distinctions between military targets or civilian ones. I think that when we analyze different attacks, when we talk about the conduct of the military, I think it's important to understand, like prospectively from the unit of analysis of the actual military committing the acts, what's happening and what are the decisions being made, rather than just saying retrospectively, oh well, a lot of civilians died, not very many military people died comparatively speaking, so it must have been war crimes. Especially when you've got another side. I'll fast forward to Hamas, that intentionally attempts to induce those same civilian numbers, because Hamas is guilty of any war crime that you would potentially accuse, and this is according to Amnesty International, people that Norman loves to cite. Hamas is guilty of all of these same war crimes, of them failing to take care of the civilian population, of them essentially utilizing human shields to try to fire rockets free from attacks. Essentially, yes. I'm just saying that essentially, in terms of how international law defines it, not how Amnesty International defines it. Amnesty International describes tons of human shielding, but they don't actually apply the correct international legal standard. I know, absolutely. I absolutely. I'm just saying, believe it or not, the entire Geneva Convention is all on Wikipedia. I'm just saying that on the Hamas side, there's an attempt to induce this type of military activity, attempt to induce civilian harm. That it's not just enough to say, like, well, here's a diary entry where a guy talks about how tragic
I think the problem with your statement is that if you go back and listen to it, the first part of it is war is hell. Civilians die. It's a fact of life. And you state that in a very factual manner. Then when you start talking about Hamas, all of a sudden you've discovered morality. and you've discovered condemnation, you've discovered intent, and you're unfortunately far from alone in this. I'll give you, you know who for me is a perfect
Well,
example?
wait, hold on. Just a second. We don't need examples.
No,
The false equivalency of the two sides is astounding. When Hamas kills civilians in a surprise attack on October 7th, this isn't because they are attempting to target military targets and they happen to stumble into a giant festival of people.
Well, they did happen to stumble into it.
They did, but when they stumbled into it, it wasn't an issue of trying to figure out military target or not. They weren't failing a distinction. There wasn't a proportionality assessment done. It was just to kill civilians. Even the Amnesty International in 2008 and in 2014, and even today, will
I don't think you'll find anyone who will deny that Hamas has targeted civilians.
Sure.
You gave the example
But there's
of suicide bombings during the Second Intifada. I mean, facts are facts.
Sure. But I'm saying that the Hamas targeting of civilians is different than the incidental loss of life that occurs when Israel does.
How, no, genocide is the intentional mass murder.
Genocide is an entirely separate claim.
Yeah, but the idea that Israel is not in the business of intentionally targeting civilians, I know that's what we're supposed to believe, but the historical record stands very clearly.
I don't believe that.
You've written about
when you say historical, do you mean like in the 40s to the 60s, or do you mean like
I would say from the 30s of the last century to the 20s of this century. I just like to make, the way you characterized it, I think the best example of that I've come across during the specific conflict is John Kirby, the White House spokesman. I've named him Tears Testosterone for a very good reason. When he's talking about Palestinian civilian deaths, war is hell, it's a fact of life, get used to it. When he was confronted with Israeli civilian deaths on October 7th, he literally broke down in tears.
He understood that one is deliberate and one isn't. He understood that.
No, that's what he tried to make us
No,
understand.
he was speaking facts. The Hamas guys who attacked the kibbutzim, apart from the attacks on the military sites, when they attacked the kibbutzim, were out to kill civilians. And they killed family after family, house after house. The Israeli attacks on Hamas installations and fighting. Don't know better. No, you don't know Israeli pilots. That's the problem.
Thank God.
You don't know Israeli pilots. They believe that they are killing Hamasniks. They're given certain objectives and that's what they attack. And if the Hamas is hiding behind civilians,
every time they target a kid, I'm sure they believe it's Hamas. When they killed the 4 kids in the
they believe
I know they believe it, even though they were committed to even though they were committed to let's see the side.
I know what he's pointing out. You've lied about this. Those kids weren't just on the beaches as opposite articles. Those kids were literally coming out of a previously identified Hamas conflict. They had operated around. They literally
Mr. Morelli, with all due respect, you're such a fantastic moron. It's terrifying. That wharf was filled with journalists. There were tens, scores of journalists. That was an old fisherman's shack. What are you talking about? It's so painful. It's so painful to listen to this idiocy.
You're implying that strike was okay on the Israeli side when they said we're just going to 4 Palestinians today for no reason.
Do you believe that?
Do you believe that? Do you believe that?
I will answer the question. I will even answer morons' questions. You want me to answer, or do you want your motor mouth to go? Okay, answer. In 2018, there was the Great March of Return in Gaza. By all reckonings of human rights organizations and journalists who were there, it was overwhelmingly nonviolent. It was whoever organized
organized by Satan.
Satan. I agree. Let's go for the big one. The big Megillah. It's Satan. Okay. Overwhelmingly organized. Overwhelmingly nonviolent. Resembled at the beginning the first Intifada. Okay, not bombs. But
they tried to make holes in the fence.
Okay, obviously. Let's continue.
Yeah.
So,
but I'm not sure Israel behaved morally in that.
Okay.
I'm willing to grant
please. Allow me to.
I don't know anything about this. I'd like to.
Okay. So, as you know, along the Gaza perimeter, there was Israel's best trained snipers. Correct?
I don't know best trained. Snipers.
Fine.
Snipers.
Okay. All right. Because hey, laugh. It's hilarious. The story's so funny.
You're lying about it. It's so much aspect of violence to it. What even the UN says it themselves.
Okay.
But you only select what the UN says you like.
See, the problem, Mr. Morelli, is you don't know the English language. You don't.
I can read from the UN website itself. The Great March of Return. Well, the vast majority of protesters acted in a peaceful manner. Most protests, dozens have approached the fence, attempting to damage it, burning fires, throwing stones, and Molotov cocktails towards Israeli forces, flying incendiary kites and balloons into Israeli territory. The latter resulted in extensive damage to agricultural land and nature reserves inside Israel, and risked the lives of Israeli civilians. Some instances shooting throwing explosives.
Talk fast. I'm just reading from the UN. Yeah, but you think you got the months wrong. You got the months wrong. We're talking about the beginning in March 30th, 2018. Okay, allow me to finish. So there were the snipers, okay? Now, you'll find it so far-fetched. Israelis purposely, deliberately targeting civilians? That's such a far-fetched idea. An overwhelmingly non-violent march. What did the international
investigation... was a campaign.
Whatever you want to call it.
For months.
Whatever you want to call it. Yeah. What did the UN investigation find?
Well, he just read it.
I read the report. I don't read things off of those machines. I read the report. What did it find? Brace yourself. You thought it was so funny, the idea of IDF targeting civilians. It found, go look this up on your machine.
I already know what you're going to say. You're going to say only 1 or 2 of them were justified killings.
Targeted journalists, targeted medics, and here's the funniest one of all. It's so hilarious. They targeted disabled people who were 300 meters away from the fence and just standing by trees.
This is true.
If it's true.
Just a quick pause. I think everything was fascinating to listen to except the mention of hilarious. Nobody finds any of this hilarious. And if any of us are laughing, it's not at the suffering of civilians or suffering of anyone. It's at the obvious joyful camaraderie in the room. So I'm enjoying it, and also the joy of learning. So thank you.
We talk about the targeting civilian thing a little bit. I think there's like an important underlying, not necessarily. I think it's important to understand. Yeah, I think it's important to understand. There's like 3 different things that we need to think about. So one is a policy of killing civilians. So I would ask the other side. I'm going to ask because another one gets your answer. Do you think there's a policy top down from the IDF to target civilians? That's one thing. A second thing is when I then the second thing is there's 2 distinctions I draw between. I think Benny would say this. I would say this. I'm sure undoubtedly there have been cases where IDF soldiers for no good reason have targeted and killed Palestinians that they should not have done. That would be prosecutable as war crimes as defined by Rome.
Some have been prosecuted.
Yeah, and I'm absolutely sure. I'm sure that we would all agree for soldiers that happens. But I think that it's important. I think it's important when we talk about military strikes, when we talk about things, especially involving bombings or drone attacks. These are things that are signed off by multiple different layers of command.
I just want to pause this quickly so we don't go too far away from the March of Return. First of all, it's called the March of Return, assuming that if thousands of them come to the border, somehow they're going to return, which is ludicrous. Secondly, what country in the world would allow that many people to come toward an enemy border where you can't tell who's Hamas and who isn't. As far as I'm concerned, they're all supporting Hamas, and they were walking up to the border trying to cut it open, throwing Molotov cocktails, throwing pipe bombs, shooting. There were all kinds of the incendiary balloons where they're burning Israeli land. This was by no means a peaceful protest. And what exactly do you want Israel to do? The fact that they're even allowing this massive congregation of people to come, where if there wasn't a border, they would walk through it like they did on October 7th. And Israel, because of international pressure, is like, you know what? Even though there are violent ones, even though they're shooting balloons over every day, let's just let them do it, because the world will go crazy if we don't. And the fact that this is even an argument point is so crazy. The fact that even Israel's even allowing such a massive group of people to show up there in the first place is such a risk. It's such a a safety issue.
Yeah, well, I mean, the other layer to this is, what is the idea of return? Well, the idea of return is that today, according to UNRWA, there's millions of Palestinian refugees, most of which are not actually refugees according to international standards, but they are according to UNRWA standards. This kind of intergenerational structure which passes refugeehood down and down and down. So if we can both agree that Gaza is Palestine, and that Gazans are Palestinians living in Palestine, and that they're now 3 to 4 generations living in Gaza, which is Palestine, which Palestine are they seeking to return to? They tell you, from the river to the sea. All the peace deals were rejected based off the idea of return into sovereign Israel, essentially turning the Jewish state into an Arab majority state. That's the only 2 states that the Arab Palestinians have ever accepted: an Arab majority state in the West Bank and Gaza, and an Arab majority state where sovereign Israel stands today in the 67 lines. So the bottom line is they're presenting this idea as something that is somehow almost innocent and speaking about it, but it's anything but. It's the very idea that leads to the Palestinians rejecting the peace accords and waging the Second Intifada. I mean, ultimately, when you think of what the idea of return is in practice, it's a political motivation to erase the Jewish state in any part of the land. That's what it is.
All right. Yep, 100%.
By multiple people involved in an operation, including intelligence gathering, including weaponeering, and there also have typically lawyers involved. When you make the claim that an IDF soldier shot a Palestinian, those 3 people, the 3 hostages that came with the white flag, something horrible happened, I think that's a fair statement to make, and I think a lot of criticism is deserved. But when you make the statement that 4 children were killed by a strike, the claim that you're making, the claim that you're making is that multiple levels of the IDF signed off on just killing.
I have no idea what
you don't understand the process. I do understand the process. I'm telling you.
You're the IDF.
No, I basically ask anybody to talk about.
Wikipedia, can you tell me what your knowledge of IDF is?
People who work in the military.
What's your knowledge of IDF?
Look this up. Do you think that bombing and strikes are decided by one person in the field? Do you think one person
respond to
every plane on drone strikes?
The pilot doesn't do it.
Yes, strikes have entire apparatuses that are designed to figure out how to strike and who to strike. So when you say that 4 children are targeted, you're saying that a whole apparatus tries to murder 4 Palestinian children.
My argument better than because really, that it's impossible at the command level. It's impossible at the command level. But you said that they couldn't have done it at the bottom if it weren't also.
You don't understand the strength of the claim that you're making. You're saying that from a top-down level, that lawyers, multiple commanders,
not tell me what I don't understand.
4 Palestinians.
It's true. It's true. I don't spend my nights on Wikipedia. I read books. I admit that as a single. Yeah, I know books are a waste of time. With all due regard, I completely respect the fact, and I'll say it on the air. As much as I find totally disgusting what's come of your politics, a lot of the books are excellent. And I'll even tell you, because I'm not afraid of saying it, whenever I have to check on a basic fact, the equivalent of going to the Britannica, I go to your books. I know you got a lot of the facts right. I would never say books are a waste of time. And it's regrettable to you that you got strapped with a partner who thinks that all the wisdom.
You didn't say they're a waste of time.
I'd like to respond to what you were saying. I think the question that we're trying to answer.
I think you don't understand Israel.
Let me finish,
really understand this.
I think we're all agreed that Palestinians have deliberately targeted civilians. Whether we're talking about Hamas and Islamic Jihad today or previously.
I prefer the word murdered and raped rather than targeted. Targeted is too soft. For what the Hamas did.
I'm not talking about.
I'm talking about this now.
Yeah, but I'm trying to answer his question. Yeah. Historically, there is substantial evidence that Palestinians have targeted civilians. Whether it's been incidental or systematic is a different discussion. I don't want to get into that now. For some reason, there seems to be a huge debate about whether any Israeli has ever sunk so low as to target a civilian.
No, we've agreed. I just said that this has happened here.
Okay, and I think
what we're saying is it's not policy, which is what you guys are implying, that they kill civilians deliberately.
If I understand you correctly, you're basically making the claim that none of these attacks could have happened without going through an entire chain of
For
command.
strike cells that are involved in like drone attacks or plane attacks or
My understanding of the Israeli military, and you could perhaps, you've served in it, you would know better, it's actually a fairly chaotic organization.
No, that's not true. Especially not the Air Force. Extremely, extremely organized. The Air Force works in a very organized fashion. As he says, with lawyers, a chain of command, and ultimately the pilot drops the bomb where he's supposed to drop it.
I think that 200 strikes in like 60 seconds, I think. I think the opening of protective edge. Like, the coordination.
You're talking about 2008.
I think 2014. But I'm just saying that the coordination of the military is pretty
Well, my understanding of the Israeli military is that it's quite chaotic, and there's also a lot of testimonies from Israel. But be that as it may, okay, I'm prepared to accept both of your contentions that it's a highly organized and disciplined force. The Air Force, under any scenario, is going to be more organized than the other branches. And you're saying such a strike would have been inconceivable.
I'm not necessarily saying it. I'm just saying like that would require.
Okay, you're basically yes. I
don't think evidence represented to say that.
Your basic claim is that it would be fair to assume that such a strike could have only been carried out with multiple levels of authorization and signing off. Okay, let's accept that for the sake of argument. We have now seen incident after incident after incident after incident where entire families are vaporized in single strikes.
Who is in the families? Who lives in the house?
Family
Inside?
members.
No,
Family
or next to the
members.
house.
Family
Which these families
we have seen incident after.
Do you know that Hamasniks weren't in that house? Do you know that their ammunition dumps weren't in
Why
that
do I have
house?
to prove a negative?
You're saying that they deliberately targeted families.
Well,
If Israel wanted to kill civilians in Gaza, they could have killed 500,000 by now with the number of strikes.
And therefore,
the fact that they only killed a certain small number,
30,000 is a small number.
Small number in
You consider
proportion.
30,000
Small
small
number in
number.
proportion over 4 months
12,000
probably is an
children
indication
is
that
only.
it's
12,000
targeted and that there are
children
Hamas targets in these places.
So I've given
12,000 children is only. And if that's the case, why is it? Yeah, you said only. Only. No, Professor Morris, here's a question for you. If we take every combat zone in the world for the past 3 years,
This is such an interesting thing to listen to now, the conversation on numbers, only because, I mean, I can't remember when this debate was, weeks ago, but we have prior information. So let's take the 30,000 number. I think the latest was 33,000. Hamas, which runs the Gaza Health Ministry, has finally admitted themselves that over 11,000 of those death counts are unaccounted for. Right? So let's minimize that to 22,000. Now, what I'm saying is based on the principle that we're accepting Hamas's number in the first place, which I think would be slightly naive to just take, a terrorist organization who basically rests their entire war strategy off something like this. But at the end of the day, if we are in principle to take Hamas's numbers at their word, then we should take the IDF's numbers at their word as well. All right, that would be the way to fairly assess this. So if you take off the 11,000 off the 33,000, you're left with 22,000. And if you look, the IDF says of that 22,000, between 10 to 12,000 are Hamas combatants. Right, so let's take the lowest figure. Let's say it's 10,000, meaning you've got a civilian combatant ratio of 1-to-1, or just over 1-to-1. The accepted international standard from the United Nations itself for this type of conflict, urban warfare, is 9-to-1. And the US wars in the Middle East were respectively 5-to-1 and 6-to-1. Now take that into account and think about Hamas's war strategy. Never in an urban warfare, in the history of urban warfare, has an organization managed to embed itself under hundreds of miles of tunnels in schools and hospitals, in civilian population centers, the way Hamas has. And then you compare it to the United Nations international accepted standard for urban warfare and the US wars, it's drastically lower. So if anything, the IDF's war has been precision, targeted, and the lowest cost to civilian life possible. We know that civilians are going to die in a war. I'm sorry to speak about it in this manner, because one death, anyone walking across the street, in my street here, or your street where you are, that let's, paint a scenario, tragically gets knocked over by a car and passes away. Every person witnessing that feels the tragedy of that incident. It's not to desensitize ourselves or derail ourselves from any morality of accepting the tragedy of an individual's death. What it is to say is that you're going to make the case that Israel is intentionally targeting civilians, or that what is happening in Gaza is indeed a genocide. And then you are going to reference all this huge amount of bombs that have been dropped on Gaza, which is 10 times the amount of bombs that America used. And yet the civilian to combatant ratio is far lower than America and far, far lower than the United Nations accepted standard. Well, then you have to be willing to accept the rational conclusion of the civilian ratio of 1-to-1, which I think kind of really unravels the entire argument.
Yeah, absolutely. The truth is that everything now with Israel is looked at with a magnifying glass. And the reality also is that I think if we're to be very straightforward here, people that don't accept our sovereignty are not going to be okay with our response to begin with. They feel that Hamas was right for what they did. They support that. And even though we have more than a right to defend the country, they don't feel that the country is worthy of defending because we shouldn't be there in the first place. So that's really the deeper argument here is
Sure.
one Gazan civilian death would be way too much in their eyes because we shouldn't even be at war with them. We should just pick up and leave. That's really that's really the deeper argument. Because whether it was 100, 20, 50, yeah, sure, if it was maybe 50 civilian deaths and we managed to defeat Gaza, the world might be like, wow, that's actually quite impressive. But would they still be happy if we defeated Hamas and say took over Gaza and try to find a new leadership? No, because we're still conquering land that's quote unquote Palestinian. So we're damned if we do and we're damned if we don't anyway.
Combat zone in the world.
In Vietnam, Americans killed
I said,
a million
I'm not
people.
talking about Vietnam. I wasn't in the anti-war movement. So don't distract me.
killed a million people in
Fine. And 30 million Russians were killed. So during World War II, so everything else is irrelevant. Okay. Here's a question. Professor Mars, here's a question. It's very perplexing. If you take every combat zone in the world for the past 3 years and you multiply the number of children killed by 4, every combat zone in the world, you get Gaza. Okay? So when you say,
supposed to prove?
okay, shut up.
You're relying on Hamas numbers.
No, I'm not lying on the numbers that everybody else. I'm not lying on the numbers.
Those are Hamas numbers,
Okay.
which may not be true. They could invent anything to show that they are an mendacious organization.
I know mendacious, believe me.
You like
Mendacious as in the
mendacious
Israeli
organization.
Ministry of Foreign Affairs. Okay, so here's the thing. You say they could have killed 500,000, but they only killed that's your word.
I'm
They
not
only
saying
killed
if
30,000.
you believe that they deliberately targeted civilians, they would have killed many more. The fact is that they don't deliberately target civilians.
Professor Mars, for a
you don't understand
for a historian, I don't want to understand Israeli society.
You don't
Even though
understand
I don't want to. I don't want to get inside their heads.
That's the problem.
90%
A good historian tries to get into the heads of
there's a limit.
the very
There's a
protagonists.
limit. When 90% of Israelis think that Israel's using enough or too little force in Gaza, I don't want to get inside that head. 40% think that Israel's using insufficient force in Gaza. I don't want to get inside that head. I don't want to get inside the head of people who think they're using insufficient force against a population, half of which is children. I don't want to get inside that head. But here's the point, because your partner wants to know the point.
Here's what I also want to interject with. I would really love to see, and when I say I love to see, I wouldn't wish this on him, but I wonder what would happen if Norman Finkelstein had several children kidnapped by a terrorist organization, and the government of say in America, some terrorists grab Norman Finkelstein's kids, kidnap them, daughters, sons, doesn't matter the age necessarily. He doesn't have any idea what's happening to them. And the US government says, hey, Norm, we can possibly, maybe get your kids back, but 500 people are going to very likely die in order for us to even attempt to get them back. I really wonder if he would take the moral high ground and say, you know, I don't really think it's right. I'd rather my kids just die.
Yeah. Well,
I think.
Yeah, carry on.
Yeah, I think he, and I don't know him, quite confident he would be like, no, get my kids back. I don't care what you have to do. Get my kids back. Especially if he has daughters that could be getting who knows what could be happening to them.
Certainly rape.
Yeah, certainly, without a question.
As well, it comes to this thing. It comes right back into the ceasefire kind of argument. What you're speaking about. There's the mendacious people calling for a ceasefire who were calling for a ceasefire before Israel even stepped in to Gaza because they're Hamas supporters and they want Hamas to survive. Then you've got people who have fallen for Hamas propaganda and what they're seeing online, who are otherwise rational people calling for a ceasefire, who are horrified by a brutal war and the October 7th massacre and see no good coming from it. Those people do exist. They've been led astray by certain facts and manipulations of reality, but they do exist. But even in their case, their activism, let's say, is not about peace, right? Their activism is pacifism. And because they're not the ones who would have to live with a jihadi terrorist organization on their border who's just massacred civilians. And it's easy to be a pacifist when you have that privilege. When you are living with a jihadi terror organization committed to the destruction of your state and of your people, who have just committed on October 7th and have promised to recommit on October 7th and October 7th and October 7th, the ceasefire that they call for is not only not entirely rational, but to some degree immoral.
Right. Rabbi Manis Friedman, if you've heard of him, have you heard of Manis Friedman?
No.
Very, very popular rabbi on YouTube. I just recorded an episode with him. Very interesting.
Okay.
And he said something very, very intelligent. He said, if Israel were to stop the war now, all of those deaths on both sides, military, Hamas, Israeli army, civilian deaths on both sides, all of that would be in vain because we didn't achieve peace. And he says peace means that there's no war. There's no, the belligerent is not attempting to cause harm for 40 years. And it comes from the Torah. It's a Torah concept. I'm not sure. I forget exactly where. Maybe I forget exactly where it comes from. But that's what he said, and I could not agree more. That the goal of defeating Hamas needs to happen. It must happen. If Israel pulls out because of international pressure, the Gazans lose out here. We need a leadership. I'm not sure what they're going to end up doing. Israel must achieve the objective in defeating Hamas. They need to. Otherwise, everything was a complete waste of time, and we'll be back at square one again.
Point. You don't understand political constraints. One of your ministers said that it's dropping the atomic bomb on
You
Gaza.
think he really meant that?
Well,
No, it was said in a sort of a
Professor
very
Morris-
questionable way. He didn't say they should drop
Professor
the
Morris-
I'm not supporting
Professor
this
Morris-
minister. This minister,
none
the Messianic
other
idiot.
than
But he didn't say drop an atomic bomb.
none other than Israel's chief historian, the justifiably famed Benny Morris, thinks we should be dropping nuclear weapons on Iran.
Iran has for years have said we should destroy Israel. You agree with that? They've said we should destroy Israel. Israel must be destroyed. Is that correct? This is what the Iranian leaders have been saying since
I
Khomeini.
would say Iranian leaders have sent mixed messages.
Okay, but some of them have said, including
Mr. Burrell,
Khamenei
if you don't
and
know the
Khomeini.
evidence, if you don't know the
Wait,
evidence,
This
why are you not?
is very funny.
It's funny
Iran
because
is the Houthi and Hamas.
Oh, yeah.
They want to
Brace yourself.
Wait.
To the extent that the Houthis are trying to stop the genocide in Gaza,
Okay, no,
I
guys, they have a right to
support
attack civilian ships.
I support
And selectively support international law when it agrees with you. And then when it doesn't, you decide
Okay,
international law.
there's no genocide in Gaza.
if you like,
Yo, hold on a second.
let me read what you said.
Norm, stop, please. Norm, just for me, please. Just give me a second. You said that there's no genocide going on in Gaza. Let me ask that clear question. The same question I asked on the Hamas attacks. Is there, from a legal, philosophical, moral perspective, is there genocide going on in Gaza today?
Is there a genocide going on in Gaza? Well, in several years, we'll have a definitive response
But
to that question. What has happened thus far is that on the 29th of December, the Republic of South Africa instituted proceedings against Israel pursuant to the 1948 Convention on the Prevention and Punishment of the Crime of Genocide. South Africa basically accused Israel of perpetrating genocide in the Gaza Strip. On the 26th of January, the court issued its initial ruling. The court at this stage is not making a determination on whether Israel has or has not committed genocide. So just as it has not found Israel guilty, it certainly also hasn't found Israel innocent. What the court had to do at this stage was take one of two decisions. Either South Africa's case was the equivalent of a frivolous lawsuit and dismiss it and close the proceedings, or it had to determine that South Africa presented a plausible case that Israel was violating its obligations under the Genocide Convention, and that it would on that basis hold a full hearing. Now, a lot of people have looked at the court's ruling of the 26th of January and focused on the fact that the court did not order a ceasefire. I actually wasn't expecting it to order a ceasefire, and I wasn't surprised that it didn't, because in the other cases that the court has considered, most prominently Bosnia and Myanmar, it also didn't order a ceasefire. And South Africa, in requesting a ceasefire, also didn't ask the court to render an opinion on the legitimacy or lack thereof of Israel's military operation. From my perspective, the key issue on the 26th of January was whether the court would simply dismiss the case or decide to proceed with it.
And they decided to proceed.
And it decided to, and I think that's enormously.
I thought that was
I think that's
beautifully
enormously.
You said they committed genocide. You already said they committed genocide. Genocide.
But if I could just
Allow me. That's correct.
now.
I don't run away.
So Norman, you did say Israel
Norm,
committed
can you
genocide.
let me finish?
Well, the end of the story is you specifically asked whether I think Israel is committing genocide. I explained formally there is no finding, and as you said, we won't know for a number of years. And I think there's legitimate questions to be raised. I mean, in the Bosnia case, which I think all four of us would agree was clearly a case of genocide, the court determined.
By the Serbs.
Yes, in the Bosnia case, the court determined that of all the evidence placed before them, only Srebrenica qualified as genocide, and all the other atrocities committed did not qualify as genocide. You know, international law is a developing organism. I don't know how the court is going to respond in this case, so I wouldn't take it as a foregone conclusion how the court is going to respond.
But
But
Norman has determined already.
I have too, because you're asking my personal
opinion is also.
So as a matter of law, I want to state very clearly, it has not been determined and won't be determined for several years. Based on my observations and the evidence before me, I would say it's indisputable that Israel is engaged in a genocidal assault against the Palestinian people.
Which is the PLO line.
That's what the program. The PLO is long past.
What
Okay, the
defines,
Palestinians
as you were saying, genocide is not a body count. Genocide consists of two elements: the destruction of a people in whole or in part. So in other words, you can commit genocide by killing 30,000 people. It doesn't have, well, 5 probably is below the threshold. Yes, but I think 30,000 crosses the threshold, and not reaching 500,000 is probably relevant. And the second element is there has to be an intent. In other words,
and you believe there's an intent?
Yes, I think if there is any other plausible reason for why all these people are being murdered, it's not genocide. And as far as intent is
what about hiding behind a human shield? You don't think that's a reason for them being killed?
well, let's get the intent part out of the way first. South Africa's.
Get South Africa.
I'd like to finish.
They
Government. That's got nothing to do with it.
I think they're pro-Satan as well last time.
No, they're pro-Hamas.
For some reason, you don't have a problem with people being pro-Israeli at the time of this, but if they support Palestinians' right to life or self-determination, they get demonized and delegitimized as
They
pro-Hamas.
supported an organization which murdered 1,200 people deliberately. That's my
But supporting a state that has murdered 30,000.
But they haven't, because these 30,000 are basically human shields used by the Hamas, which the Hamas wanted killed. They wanted them killed. Hamas wanted these people killed.
If I could just get...
You don't think they wanted them killed? They
No, I don't.
provide them with shelters. They build tunnels for their fighters, but not one shelter for their own civilians.
You asked me about
Of course they want them killed.
You asked me about intent, and the reason that I bought in the South African application is because it is actually exceptionally detailed on intent by quoting numerous.
All sorts of idiotic ministers in Israel.
Well, yeah, including the Prime Minister, the Defense
Prime
Minister,
Minister
the Chief of Staff.
didn't say genocide.
No, he said
According to Asa Kasher,
Use the word
according to
because
Asa
the
Kasher,
Hamas are a really
according to Asa
organization.
Kasher, according to Asa Kasher, the philosopher of Haide, he said that Netanyahu was avowing genocide. So he's an idiot.
So
He's an idiot, but he's past it.
So the reason I raised the South African application is twofold: Hamas or no Hamas. It's exceptionally detailed on the question of intent. And secondly, when the International Court of Justice issues a ruling, individual justices have the right, can give their own opinion. And I found the German one to be the most interesting on this specific question, because he was basically saying that he didn't think South Africa presented a persuasive case, but he said their section on intent was so overpowering that he felt he was left with no choice but to vote with the majority. So I think that answers the intent part of your question.
So for the ICJ case that South Africa's brought, I think there's a couple things that need to be mentioned. One is, and I saw you two talk at length about this, the plausibility standard is incredibly low. The only thing we're looking for is a basic presentation of facts that make it conceivable, possible, that plausible, which legally this is obviously below criminal conviction, below below.
Think of it as an indictment.
Sure, possibly, maybe even a lower level than even an indictment. So plausibility is an incredibly low standard, number one. Number two, if you actually go through and you read the complaint that South Africa filed, I would say that if you go through the quotes and you even follow through to the source of the quotes, the misrepresentation that South Africa does in their case about all these horrendous quotes, in my opinion, borders on criminal.
Well, 16 ICJ judges disagree.
That's fine if 16 ICJ judges disagree, but I'm going to give...
incompetent.
They could be, but...
even the American judge, she must have been awful incompetent if she was unable to see the misrepresentations that Mr. Bonnell, based on his Wikipedia entry, was able to find.
So this is based on the official ICJ report that was released. I'm not sure if you read the entire
I read every
Did you go through and actually identify any of the sources?
Actually, brace yourself for this, and Moeen could confirm it. Yaniv Kogan, an Israeli, and Jamie Stern-Weiner, half Israeli, they checked every single quote in the Hebrew original. And Yaniv Kogan, love the guy, he has terrifying powers of concentration. He checked every single quote. Is that correct, Moeen? And Jamie checked every single quote in the English, in the context. And where there were any contextual questions, they told us.
I think they found one.
Yeah, I think they found one. So I do not believe that those 15 judges, was 15 to 2.
16 to 2, I think.
They're 15 in the court plus 2, so it's 17, so it's 15 to 2. I don't think those 15 judges were incompetent, and I certainly don't believe the president of the court, an American, would allow herself to be duped.
Okay,
you might be called Mr. Burrell.
Sure. So this was taken from the South African complaint. There's tons of these, but so here's one. In the complaint for the ICJ, they said that on the 12th of October, 2023, President Isaac Herzog made clear that Israel was not distinguishing between militants and civilians in Gaza, stating in a press conference to foreign media in relation to Palestinians in Gaza, over 1 million of whom are children. Quote, it's an entire nation out there that is responsible. It is not true. This rhetoric about civilians not aware, not involved. It's absolutely not true, and we will fight until we break their backbone. End quote. If you actually go to the news article, they even link it in their complaint. The full context for the quote was, quote, it is an entire nation out there that is responsible. It's not true. This rhetoric about civilians not being aware, not involved. It's absolutely not true. They could have risen up. They could have fought against that evil regime, which took over Gaza in a coup d'état. But we are at war. We are defending our homes. We are protecting our homes. That's the truth. And when a nation protects its home, it fights, and we will fight until we break their backbone. He acknowledged that many Gazans had nothing to do with Hamas, but was adamant that others did. Quote, I agree. There are many innocent Palestinians who don't agree with this, but you have a missile in your goddamn kitchen and you want to shoot it at me. Am I allowed to defend myself? We have to defend ourselves. We have the right to do so. This is not the same as saying there's no distinction between militants and civilians in Gaza. His statement here is actually fully compliant with international law to the letter, because if you are storing military supplies in civilian areas, these things become military targets, and you're allowed to do proportionality assessments afterwards. So this is supposed to be one of many quotes that they've shown that's supposed to demonstrate genocidal intent, but it is very easily explained by military intent or by a conflict between two parties.
I saw that press conference.
Wait, let me just say something. All of this talk is a bit irrelevant because it may sound to the listeners that the court in The Hague has ruled that Israel is committing genocide.
No, I think
it hasn't.
no.
It's just going in the next few years to look at the whole subject. There has
Okay,
been no determination at all. And as Stephen says, some of the quotes are not exactly accurate quotes or taken out of context.
Okay, it is correct, as Moeen put it, that it'll be several years before the court makes a determination.
And my guess is it will determine there was no genocide. That's my guess. That's not just my guess.
I can't predict. I got it all wrong, actually, as Moeen will attest. I got it all wrong the first time. I never thought the American judge would vote in favor of plausibility.
So you admitted you were wrong?
Yeah, of course. I think I tell Moeen twice a day I was wrong about this and I was wrong about that. I'm not wrong about the facts. I try not to be, but my speculations, they can be wrong. Okay, leaving that aside. First of all, as Moeen pointed out, there's a difference between the legal decision or the ruling and an independent judgment. Now, South Africa was not filing a frivolous case. That was 84 pages. It was single.
Even 84
It was
pages can
single
be
spaced.
frivolous.
It was an hour and a half to read. It was not a massive case.
It was single spaced and had literally hundreds of footnotes.
It can still be frivolous.
It's possible.
Of course,
It could be.
wasn't.
Yeah, I read the report. To tell you the truth, I followed very closely everything that's been happening to October 7th. I was mesmerized. I couldn't believe the comprehensiveness of that particular report. Number two, there are two quite respected judges. Excuse me. There were two quite respected experts of international law sitting on the South African panel, John Dugard and Vaughan Lowe. Vaughan Lowe, as you might know, he argued the war case in 2004 before the International Court of Justice. Now, they were not, they were alleging genocide, which in their view means the evidence in their minds, we're not yet at the court, the evidence in their minds compels the conclusion that genocide is being committed. I am willing, because I happen to know Mr. Dugard personally and I've corresponded with Vaughan Lowe, I've heard their claim, I've read the report, I would say they make a very strong case. But let's agree plausible. Now, here's a question. If somebody qualifies for an Olympic team, let's say a regional person qualifies for an Olympic team, it doesn't mean they're going to be on the Olympic team. It doesn't mean they're going to win a gold medal, a silver medal, or a bronze medal.
They can swim, that's what you're saying.
No, I would say that's a very high bar to even qualify.
Swim well enough to have a realistic prospect of winning a medal.
So, to even make it to plausible,
That is not true.
even,
That is not
it's
what
a
plausible
very
means.
high.
It is absolutely
Mr.
dead
Borelli,
wrong.
Mr. Borelli, please don't teach me about the English language.
So the declaration
I said
says that the court
plausibility
is not
is the
asked
same
in the present
concept as
phase.
qualifying.
The court is not asked at this present phase of the proceedings to determine whether South Africa's allegations of genocide are
Did I just say
well-founded.
that?
They're not
Did I just
well-founded.
say
They're not
that?
even well-founded. The
Did
court
I-
is used to the plausible as a high standard. It's absolutely not. It is a misrepresentation of the strength of the case against Israel, just like the majority of the quotes they have in this case are. And also, instead of an extremely well-founded case, they spend like 1/4 of all of the quotations. Some even quote from the Goldstone report. They try to actually deal with the intent part, which is, by the way, I think you guys, I don't know if you use the phrase the dolo specialis, that the intentional part of genocide,
I don't know that term.
I think it's called dolo specialis, is the most important part of genocide, which is proving the highly special intent to commit genocide. It's possible that Israel could.
That's mens rea.
No. The mens rea, yes, I understand the state of mind, but for genocide, there is dolo specialis is a highly special intent. Did you read the case? It is a
Mr.
highly
Borelli,
special intent.
I'm going to ask you again.
Yes.
Please stop displaying your imbecility.
Okay,
Do
I'm
not
telling you the declaration of
don't
imbecility.
put on public display that you're a moron. At least have the self-possession to shut up. Did I read the case?
my display on camera,
Borelli,
yours in
Mr.
books,
Borelli,
okay?
I read the case around 4 times. I read all of the majority opinion, the declarations. I read Aaron Barak's declaration.
Then why are you lying and saying plausible high standard?
Because I said even reaching the benchmark of plausibility is a very high standard in the world. It's the equivalent of a regional player qualifying for an Olympics. It's still 2 steps removed. You may not be on the team and you may not get a medal, but to get qualified, which in this context is the equivalent of plausible, you must be doing something pretty horrible. And as it happens, Professor Morris,
that's what the court will rule. Remember what I just told you.
I don't expect to be even around when the court reaches its final decision. Why? It'll take a long, long time.
2 years.
No, I don't think it'll take 2 or 3 years.
I mean, Bosnia, which was admittedly a special type of case because they were accusing Serbia of sponsoring the Bosnian Serbs. That took, I think, 17 years. From 90.
I assume they'll take 2 or 3 years.
But the point you're making, so
I'm
this is
saying that
illegal.
something horrible must be happening to even achieve.
It's horrible. It's a war.
Yeah.
That's true, yes. But I think-
they weren't rendering a ruling on a war. They were rendering a ruling on a genocide.
And I think the
They
suggestion.
said it's plausible. They also said it's plausible that Israel is committing military operation as well.
Yeah, but I think the problem with your characterization is you're saying in so many words that South Africans basically only have to show up in court with a coherent
Right,
statement.
That's correct.
In today's atmosphere, that's probably correct.
They needed to do a lot more.
Not
They
much
needed
more.
to
The
persuade.
American
Today's atmosphere,
The American
They needed to persuade.
Judges go according to what the majority want to hear.
Yeah, but they
He was
needed
the president.
They needed to persuade the court that it was worth investing several years of their time in
They're
hearing
well
this
paid
case.
for it, so
They're well paid whether they
have
take this case or not. I mean, they have a full docket whether they accept or reject this case. And I don't think we should.
Remember what I just said. They won't rule there was genocide. Remember what I said.
Also, I recommend people actually read the case and follow through a lot of the quotes, that they just don't show genocidal
Borelli,
intent.
right,
The Israeli Minister of
Mr.
Finance on the
Borelli.
8th of October 2023, this is dated from the ICJ, this is from South Africa's submission, Bezalel Smotrich, I can't read this, stated, there you go, okay, I immediately the Israeli cabinet that, quote, we need to deal a blow that hasn't been seen in 50 years and take down Gaza, end quote. But again, if you click through and you read the source, their own linked source, it says, as per the own source, quote, the powerful finance minister, settler leader, Bezalel Smotrich, I can't pronounce this, demanded at the cabinet meeting late Saturday that the army, quote, hit Hamas brutally and not take the matter of the captives into significant consideration, end quote. Quote, in war as in war, you have to be brutal, end quote. He was quoted as saying, quote, we need to deal a blow that hasn't been seen in 50 years and take down Gaza, end quote. You can't strip the quotation of Hamas, anything you're with, and then there's genocidal intent.
That's not genocide.
Hey,
So when Ukraine says we need to defeat Russia,
That's not genocide.
no, when Ukraine says we need to defeat Russia, is that genocide? Don't killing all Russian citizens.
Professor Morris, here's another one. When the defense, ridiculous.
Yes, ridiculous.
The American judge,
He also doesn't govern policy.
the American judge read.
You're holding the American judge to.
Well, he was the president.
Until the source of authority when it appears, and we won't deal with the actual facts of the matter.
Okay, the American judge read several of the quotes.
Look at the American Supreme Court today. They may support. Shows you how
Professor Morris, without going too far afield, if you heard a statement by the defense minister said, we are going to prevent any food, water, fuel, or electricity from entering Gaza.
Did Israel do that?
Okay, no, I'm wondering.
What he said
I'm asking you,
Israeli
but we're talking about statements now, intent. How would you interpret that?
After 1,200 of your citizens are murdered the way they were, I would expect extreme statements by lots of politicians.
But
by lots of politicians.
you don't accept extreme
That's not
Palestinian.
Israeli policy.
Wait, but you don't
What he
accept.
said isn't Israeli policy.
But you don't
They let in water, they let in gas.
Untrue.
You don't accept
Untrue.
extreme Palestinian statements after they lost their entire country, not just 1,200
That's a
people.
good point. No, it's a good point.
And on that, on that brief moment of agreement, let's just take a quick pause. We need a smoke break, we need a water break, we need a bathroom
Take
break.
down Gaza is not a genocide.
Taking
what it
Russia
means.
is a genocide
What does take down
statement. We
Gaza
went to war with Iraq, we wanted to destroy Iraq, that was a
Take down
genocidal
Gaza.
statement.
So first of all, thank you for that heated discussion about the present. I would love to go back into history in a way that informs what we can look for in by way of hope for the future. So when has in Israel and Palestine have we been closest to something like a peace settlement, to something that like where both sides would be happy and enable the flourishing of both peoples?
Well, from my knowledge of the 120 years or so of conflict, the closest I think the two sides have been to reaching some sort of settlement appears to have been in the year 2000 when Barack and then subsequently Clinton offered a two-state settlement to PLO Palestinian Authority chairman Yasser Arafat. And Arafat seemed to waver. He didn't immediately reject what was being offered, but ultimately he came down at the end of Camp David in July 2000. He came down against the proposals, and Clinton, who said he wouldn't blame him, later blamed Arafat for bringing down the summit and not reaching a solution there. But I think they're on the table, certainly in the Clinton parameters of December 2000, which followed the proposals by Barack in July. The Palestinians were offered the best deal they're ever going to get from Israel, unless Israel is destroyed, and then they'll just be a Palestinian Arab state. But the best deal that Israel could ever offer them, they were offered, which essentially was 95% of the West Bank, East Jerusalem, half of the old city of Jerusalem, some sort of joint control of the Temple Mount, and the Gaza Strip, of course, in full. And the Palestinians said no to this deal. And nobody really knows why Arafat said no. That is, some people think he was trying to hold out for slightly better terms. But my reading is that he was constitutionally, psychologically incapable of signing off on a two-state deal, meaning acceptance of the existence of a Jewish state. This was really the problem.
Of Israel or of a Jewish state?
Of a Jewish state, the Jewish state of Israel. He wasn't going to share Palestine with the Jews and put his name to that. I think he just couldn't do it. That's my reading. But some people say it was because the terms were insufficient and he was willing, but was waiting for slightly better terms. I don't buy that. I don't think so. But other people disagree with me on this.
What do you think?
Well, just briefly in response, Arafat formally recognized Israel in 1993.
Yeah, totally.
I don't think actually that in 2000, 2001, a genuine resolution was on offer, because I think the maximum Israel was prepared to offer, admittedly more than it had been prepared to offer in the past, fell short of the minimum that the Palestinians considered to be a reasonable two-state settlement, bearing in mind that as of 1949, Israel controlled 78% of the British Mandate of Palestine. The Palestinians were seeking a state on the remaining 22%, and this was apparently too much for Israel. My response to your question would be...
Wait, they were being offered something like 22 or 21%.
They were being offered, I think, less than a withdrawal to the 1967 borders with mutual and minor and reciprocal land swaps and the just resolution of
the refugee problem was one of the questions.
Yes. I worked for a number of years with International Crisis Group, and my boss at the time was Rob Malley, who was one of the American officials present at Camp David.
Out of the department,
the point I want to make about Rob was he wrote, I think, a very perceptive article in 2001 in the New York Review of Books. I know that you and Ehud Barak have had a debate with him, but I think he gives a very compelling reason of why and how Camp David failed. But rather than going into that,
you wrote that together with Hussein Ara.
Hussein Ara, yes, who was not at Camp David.
Yes.
But in response to your question, I think there could have been a real possibility of Israeli-Palestinian and Arab-Israeli peace in the mid-1970s, in the wake of the 1973 October War. I'll recall that in 1971, Moshe Dayan, Israel's defense minister at the time, full of triumphalism about Israel's victory in 1967, speaking to a group of Israeli military veterans, stated, if I had to choose between Sharm el-Sheikh without peace or peace without Sharm el-Sheikh, this is referring to the resort in Egyptian Sinai, which was under Israeli occupation, Dayan said, I will choose for Sharm el-Sheikh without peace. Then the 1973 war came along, and I think Israeli calculations began to change very significantly. And I think it was in that context that had there been a joint U.S.-Soviet push for an Arab-Israeli and Israeli-Palestinian resolution that incorporated both an Israeli withdrawal to the 1967 lines and the establishment of a Palestinian state in the occupied territories, I think there was a very reasonable prospect for that being achieved. It ended up being aborted, I think, for several reasons, and ultimately the Egyptian president, Anwar Sadat, decided, for reasons we can discuss later, to launch a separate unilateral initiative for Israeli-Egyptian rather than Arab-Israeli peace. And I think once that set in motion, the prospects disappeared because Israel...
I find this fascinating. He's speaking about no actual concrete deal that was put on the table. He's speaking about that it was possible that something could have happened there. But the reality is that actual concrete deals have been put on the table. As Professor Benny Morris spoke about in 2000, later in 2000, in December, the Clinton parameters, in 2001 at Taba, again in 2008, even after a Gaza withdrawal, with the Olmert plan, which offered more concessions to the Palestinians. These were actual offers that were made, concrete, on the table, rejected by the Palestinians. And Rabbani's argument is to ignore the actual concrete offers on the table at when we could have been closest to peace, and to speak about a hypothetical that never ever happened, with no concrete offers. And I think that this is the fatal flaw in the Palestinian narrative, is that at bottom, we can all point the fingers and blame each other for many things. That's for sure. The Palestinians have a lot to be aggrieved by Israel. The Israelis have a lot to be aggrieved by the Palestinians. There's plenty of blame to go around in any conflict between two belligerents. But if the objective is at all to solve the conflict, then at bottom, the Palestinians have been the only side to not only open war, as they did on October 7th, but to never not only offer a peace deal, an actual concrete peace deal. They've never offered that. They have only rejected concrete peace offers. At bottom, that is where the crisis is. it seems totally irrational to me that anyone chooses to ignore those 4 events that I just spoke about, where concrete offers were put on the tables and the Palestinians responded no. And they responded with violence following their no. And yet those are willfully ignored on the side of the Palestinian narrative, as if they're of no consequence and if they never happened. And they speak about a hypothetical in 1970. The reality is he's making the case that Israel, he's making a quote from Moshe Dayan in 1971, which is, by the way, a quote, and it's true that he said that. But in reality, Israel is no longer in Egypt, and it removed itself and withdrew from Sinai as a result of the Egyptian peace accord. So everything he's speaking about is hypotheticals. Israel did actually withdraw from that territory in exchange for a peace deal. Could that peace deal have encompassed the Palestinians and other Arab states? Perhaps, except there was no actual peace deal on the table. Nothing concrete. The only thing that was concrete was between Egypt and Israel.
Right.
So the only time there's been something between the Israelis and the Palestinians, besides obviously the Peel commissions and the partition plans, was those multiple offers and deals put on the table in Camp David 1 and 2 and Taba and the Clinton parameters. So it seems totally irrational to me that people would say that that's when they were closest to peace, and willfully ignore that as part of a distinct problem to reaching any sort of peace accord.
Yeah, absolutely. So what I was thinking of is, with Egypt, it worked because Egypt was a separate country who did have the interest in defeating Israel at a point, but realized that they couldn't do it by military means, and essentially said, "Give us the Sinai and we'll be done with it." And that's proven to work. In the state of Palestinians, another point I wanted to bring back from this Rabbi Manas, he mentioned something very interesting, and he uses biblical ideas to make his points, but I do think from a pragmatic standpoint, he says, because the Palestinians are highly religious, they believe that Ishmael, or Ishmael, as people say, was the inheritor of the land of Israel, and therefore us offering land to them is an insult, because the rabbi says, and I quote, "Who are you," meaning the Palestinians are saying this to us, "who are you to offer me parts of my land?"
Yes.
So if you think about it, it's completely what that is. I can't think of any other logical reason. What the rabbi is saying is so astute. It's so logical. The Palestinians are coming from a biblical context and saying, "Hey, we inherited this land. It doesn't belong to the Jews. It's our Muslim land. So in this case, you have no right to offer me what's already mine. You don't belong here. You have no right to it. So we're never going to agree to this peace plan, because we don't want you here. We don't want you to rule the land that's inherently ours. So no, we'll never agree to this." And the
Yes.
Jews, unfortunately, keep believing this idiocy. We really have to listen to what they're telling us. We have to stop thinking, you know what? You do want peace. I've said this, I think, in part 1, I was saying the same thing. You do want peace. Trust me, guys. Stop with this desire to kick us out. Let's work it out. Let's give you some more land. It'll work. They're saying, no. Again, to reiterate, you're insulting us by even considering this idea in the first place. And that's why I think that really brings the point home. So they're going on all about these. Yeah, go ahead.
Yeah, sorry. I think the rabbi's conclusion on the mindset of the Palestinians and their approach to it is correct. Whether it's biblical or not is debatable. I mean, that could be, there's certainly that layer, but I think there's other layers to it as well. But the actual conclusion of where it's coming from is certain. You know, and it links to something that I said earlier in our first video, when it was just me and you having a talk, and I said that there's a difference between peace and justice, and there's this famous saying that gets chanted on your streets in America: "No justice, no peace." And that is indicative. If the Palestinians view the entire existence of Israel as unjust and illegitimate because the land between the river to the sea is theirs, well, then, like the rabbi said, why are you offering us what we already have? This is not justice. This is an injustice. Even in the 67 borders, this is injustice. You are still taking a part of our land. And the Palestinians will really need to undergo some sort of shift if they want peace, away from justice, because when people seek justice, they actually seek absolute justice. There's no such thing as absolute justice. It's a false perception of reality. And when people seek justice, they're never willing to make concessions, which is precisely what is required for peace.
Yeah.
So I think that is also, maybe just a kind of a psychological methodology that is recurrent throughout the Palestinian experience over the last century. But I think he's correct. I think his conclusion of the mindset is correct. Whether it's strictly biblical or not is up for debate. I think it could be a multifaceted, also pan-Arab nationalism, which one could then argue is rooted in the Islamic conquest. There's many arguments around it, but the at bottom the mindset is I think accurate.
Yeah, that's great. There's so many ironic things. Here, let's continue. That's when I realized, listening to such a long debate, that a lot of this back and forth can be summed up if we're willing to step into the deep waters, and we don't just continue to swim in the shallow side of the pool. You peel back some layers and what both sides really want, and we're really, really, truly honest about what the intentions of both sides are. We can spend a lot less time having such a long debate. Quite frankly, this debate didn't need to be nearly as long as it is.
Agreed.
But for political correctness sake, this is what happens. The political correctness causes a 5-hour debate that probably could have been had in 45 minutes to an hour. That's my personal take.
Essentially saw its most powerful adversary removed from the equation and felt that this would give it a free hand in the occupied territories, also in Lebanon, to get rid of the PLO and so on. So, you ask when were we closest, and I can't give you an answer of when we were closest. I can only tell you when I think we could have been close, and that was a lost opportunity. If we look at the situation today, there's been a lot of discussion about a two-state settlement. My own view, and I've written about this, I don't buy the arguments of the naysayers that we have passed the so-called point of no return with respect to a two-state settlement. Certainly, if you look at the Israeli position in the occupied territories, I would argue it's more tenuous than was the French position in Algeria in 1954, than was the British position in Ireland in 1916, than was the Ethiopian position in Eritrea in 1990. And so, as a matter of practicality, as a matter of principle, I do think the establishment of a Palestinian state in the occupied territories remains realistic. I think the question that we now need to ask ourselves, it's one I'm certainly asking myself since October 7th, and looking at Israel's genocidal campaign, but also looking at larger questions. Is it desirable? Can you have peace with what increasingly appears to be an irrational, genocidal state that seeks to confront and resolve each and every political challenge with violence, and that reacts to its failure to achieve solutions to political challenges with violence by applying even more violence, that has an insatiable lust for Palestinian territory, that a genocidal apartheid state that seems increasingly incapable of even conceiving of peaceful coexistence with the other people on that land. So I'm very pessimistic that a solution is possible. I look at, I grew up in Western Europe in the long shadow of the Second World War. I think we can all agree that there could have been no peace in Europe had certain regimes on that continent not been removed from power. I look at Southeast Asia in the late 1970s, and I think we're all agreed that there could not have been peace in that region had the Khmer Rouge not been ousted. I look at Southern Africa during the 1990s, and I think we can all be agreed that had the white minority regimes of that ruled Zimbabwe and South Africa not been dismantled, there could not have been peace in that region. And although I think it's worth having a discussion, I do think it's now a legitimate question to ask, can there be peace without dismantling the Zionist regime? And I make a very clear distinction between the Israeli state and its institutions on the one hand, and the Israeli people, who I think, regardless of our discussion about the history, I think you can now talk about an Israeli people and a people that have developed rights over time. And a formula for peaceful coexistence with them will need to be found, which is a separate matter from dismantling the Israeli state and its institutions. And again, I haven't reached clear conclusions about this, except to say, as a practical matter, I think a two-state settlement remains feasible, but I think there are very legitimate questions about its desirability and about whether peace can be achieved in the Middle East with the persistence of an irrational, genocidal apartheid regime, particularly because Israeli society is beginning to develop many extremely distasteful, supremacist, dehumanizing aspects that I think also stand in the way of coexistence that are being fed by this regime.
So if you look back into history, when we're closest to peace, and do you draw any hope from any of them?
I feel like in 2000, I feel like the deal that was present, at least at the end of the Taba summit, I think in terms of what Israel, I think, had the appetite to give and what the Palestinians would have gotten, would have definitely been the most agreeable between the two parties. I I don't know if in 73, I'm not sure if the appetite would have ever been there for the Arab states to negotiate alongside the Palestinians. I know that in Jordan, there was no love for the Palestinians after 1970, after Black September. I know that Sadat had no love for the Palestinians due to their association with the Muslim Brotherhood, attempted assassinations in Egypt.
Sorry, which? PLO and the Muslim Brotherhood?
Sadat was upset.
That's what's also so funny is the Arab countries can't even get along, and they're expecting Israel to get along with them. They're expecting.
Well, I mean, also, like at the end of the day, there was a reason why the Egyptians and the Jordanians, respectively, the Egyptians in Gaza, the Jordanians in the West Bank, between 1949 to 1967, they occupied that territory. They had 2 decades to establish a Palestinian state. Why wasn't it done? It wasn't done because of what we saw with the war opened in 1967 with the Six-Day War, an attempt to wipe Israel off the map. So for 20 years, they built up almost a revenge plot for the outcome of 1948. And until that revenge plot has no ground and no standing, there won't be any peace. I don't say peace is impossible with the Palestinians. I think that there's been plenty of peoples or regimes who have needed to undergo a collective consciousness shift, and who have done it, and who have lived at peace with their neighbors. That's the issue with the Palestinians, is their process of initiating aggression with the desire to either complete a revenge for the outcome of 1948 or celebrate triumphantly as if they've already won the war upon the initiation of the aggression. And upon their military defeat, it's seen as a natural disaster rather than the consequences of those decisions that they made. And then they turn themselves into righteous victims. And from there, all their ideas of what the goals of the war were are forgotten until the revenge plot comes around again. And that's essentially the Palestinian predicament in a nutshell for a century. If something like that changes, there'll be peace almost instituted immediately. I really believe that. I don't think peace is impossible. I just wonder if the Palestinians are prepared to undergo that. The Bosnians, the Serbians did it, the Rwandans did it, the Japanese did it after World War II. Rabbani's statements about European regimes, that's an implicit reference clearly to the Nazis. And I think it's ironic given what—
I know where you're going with that.
Yeah, I think it's ironic given what Hamas's charter states, what Hamas did on October 7th, what they've promised to continue doing if they're still around as an organization following this war, the anti-Semitism of the organization, anti-Semitism, I mean, and the Palestinian National Project being led by Haj Amin al-Husseini, who was actually a Nazi himself, meaning that he was working on the Nazi payroll to recruit Bosnian Muslims for the Nazi war effort, and he received a salary from Berlin. He worked in Berlin for 4 years for the Nazi regime from the SS officers. So I think it's a total obfuscation of history, historical reality, and a total twist of reality to push that agenda onto Israel as if Israel was the Nazi regime. I won't even get into the immoral aspects of it or whatever, but I'd say almost that it's a silent admission of guilt on the part of the Palestinians themselves.
Very, very well. So yeah, very well very well said. It's so interesting.
Because there were attempted assassinations by people in, an assassination. He was a personal friend of his, Yusuf al-Sibai, I can't pronounce that. He was assassinated by a
Killed by the Abu Nidal organization.
Admittedly, he says he wants to group, not Gillo directly, but I think that there was a history of the Palestinians sometimes fighting with their neighboring states that were hosting if they weren't getting the political concessions they wanted. The assassination of the Jordanian king in 51 might be another example of that in Jordan. It feels like over a long period of time, it feels like the Palestinians have been kind of told from the neighboring Arab states that if they—
One thing that I was thinking was what you said. I think ultimately, similarly to with the major wars that Israel fought, respect is going to be what gets us peace ultimately. And similarly to how America had to kill tons of Japanese, tons of Germans, it's not that I want Gazans to die, but there needs to be a level of respect where the Palestinians say it is not worth it. It's not worth it.
Yeah. I don't think it's calculated. It needs to rest on the idea of civilians dying. What they need to understand is that the state of Israel is not going anywhere.
Yeah.
And that their agenda to destroy it essentially is not serving them.
the juice isn't worth the squeeze. That's what I always say in this circumstance, because they think, because in the rest of the world, all these pro-Palestinian supporters, they have this mental blockage where they think that the Jewish people in the modern state of Israel are these random foreigners, and they don't understand how we see it. Even a Jew like me who grew up in America, a Jew like you who grew up in South Africa. I didn't grow up in Israel, but to me, when I go there, when I talk about it, when I live my everyday life, Israel to me is completely a part of who I am. It's a
Yeah.
part of my identity. You can't rip that out of a Jewish person. You can't do it. Every house I went to growing up had a picture of Jerusalem in the living room or somewhere in the hallway. It you'll have a picture of Jerusalem on someone's mezuzah, or whoever doesn't know who that is, on the doorpost. You have that biblical scroll. It's on almost every Jewish household. Jerusalem, Israel, is synonymous with Jewish people. You need people listening to this who are anti-Israel. You're either going to have to accept it at some point, or you're just going to have to accept the fact that we aren't going anywhere unless you forcibly remove us through military action. It's
Yeah.
just not going to happen. And for the foreseeable future, Israel will continue to get stronger, and the war that you're looking to wage against this is going to become harder and harder, because we're not going to just decide to leave like the British during the Mandate. This country is our country, and that's
Well,
just
I think, this is the indictment of ignorance on the part of Rabbani, in that he does reference, actually, when he's speaking about other regimes, he references the French in Algeria. So that's the implicit statement that he looks at the conflict as the French colonialists in Algeria. The Israelis are the French colonialists. That's the analogy he's drawing. The Algerians are the Palestinians. And enough resistance on the part of the Algerians chased the French out of Algerian territory. The difference is that the French were actually colonialists, and whether people want to debate this or think, the bottom line is the Jews see themselves as kin to the land, and therefore the acts of resistance and terrorism are not actually going to do anything. They haven't done anything to exercise any sort of exile or
Let
the
me
Jews
just say something.
from the land because of terrorism. And that is actually the fundamental flaw in the assessment of the Palestinians, that terrorism, as it did work in Algeria with the French, is going to work with the Israelis. It isn't.
We're not going to leave because we know what happened when we lived among other countries and didn't have a military and didn't have defense of our own. You see, when October 7th happened, every Israeli got together, whether if they were in the military, everybody suited up, put on uniforms. Jews from outside of Israel were donating millions and millions of dollars for military gear, for food, for equipment, for whatever, for what have you. And the country got together, and people got together and said, we're not going anywhere. We got to fight this war. We have to protect our country. If we were French colonialists, forget about it. People would have been, half the country would have left. 3/4 of the country would have been gone. People would have just waved the white flag. We would have said, we don't belong here anyway. Well, this isn't worth dying for. Very much the opposite is how the Jews see it. It's very obvious. You see the response of the Jewish people after October 7th. It's clear as day that yeah.
Well, if you think of October 7th, the morning of October 7th, what's interesting about that is within 24 hours from this attack, while the Hamasniks were still basically in the region, I was supposed to be attending the anti-government protests, which, if it wasn't the case that October 7th happened, I would have been there, as I was there week in and week out for 9 months. The country was incredibly divided, but the country also understands that when we're divided and when we're fighting, it's because we're fighting against each other, because we believe that what we think is what is actually in the best interests of the state of Israel. Right. So when I'm fighting against the government, I think it's because the government doesn't have the best interests of the state of Israel at hand. That's why 150,000 strong, week in and week out after 9 months, which the polls show equivocated to roughly, because it wasn't the same 150,000 people week in and week out, to about 1.5 to 2 million of the Israeli population. I mean, that's a third of the population protested over those 9 months. And even more didn't support the government's reform. But the bottom line is almost every single one of those 150,000 people week in and week out were holding the Israeli flag and singing Hatikva.
Right.
This was not an anti-Israel protest. This was a pro-Israel protest because we were standing there fighting against the government because we believed that the government wasn't going to do what was in Israel's best interest. So when October 7th comes along, both peoples on either side of that camp know what is in Israel's best interest. So they came together for Israel's best interests. That is what people don't understand. They say, wow, the country was so divided, then all of a sudden it was united because of the war. Yes, but that's because the peoples of Israel operate, even in division, on what is in the best interest of the state of Israel. And on October 8th, it was in the best interest. I stood, on October 8th, I went to Dizengoff Square here in Tel Aviv and started packing clothes, okay? And I was speaking to the woman, and she told me that she was a Likudnik and she had voted Bibi into power. Now, 24 hours before that, I would have had a heated debate with her about this government. We didn't. We packed clothes to send to the south for the children. Because at that moment, what was important was what was in Israel's best interest and the people of Israel's best interest. And what we were doing was in the best interest of the state of Israel. And we were able to silently, without saying anything, put aside our differences that 24 hours before probably would have led to the both of us ripping each other's heads off in a political debate.
But that's what's so beautiful about our country, man. That really is what's so special, is that we can have those crazy disagreements to the point of wanting to rip each other's throats out. But unlike the Arab world, we won't actually do that. That's the primary difference.
Just continue to enact violence, whether in Israel or abroad, that eventually a state will materialize somehow. I don't think it's gotten them any closer to a state. If anything, I think it's taken them farther and farther and farther away from one. And I think as long as the hyperbolic language is continually employed internationally, the idea that Israel is committing a genocide, the idea that there's an apartheid, the idea that they live in a concentration camp, all of these words, I think, further the narrative for the Palestinians that Israel is an evil state that needs to be dismantled. You said as much about the institution, at least of the Zionist government. Israel's government is probably not going anywhere. All of the other surrounding Arab states have accepted that, or at least most of them down in the Gulf, Egypt and Jordan have accepted that. The Palestinians need to accept it too. The Israeli state, or the state apparatus, is not going anywhere. And at some point, they need to realize, like, hey, we need a leader that's going to come out and represent us, represent all of us, is willing to take political risks, is willing to negotiate.
This is exactly what we're saying. Destiny understands this. He's like, the Arab world needs to they need to come to terms with this.
Some lasting peace for us. And it's not going to be the international community or some invocation of international law.
You're saying something?
A lot of them have. I mean, you saw with the Iranian attack, Jordan deployed its air force to prevent it. The Saudis, who we don't even have normalized peaceful relations with, were involved in preventing it. Because at the end of the day, they've come to the conclusion that a strong Israel is essential for their survival, not a threat. And the day that Palestinians understand that the existence of the state of Israel next to them does not need to be a threat, will be the same outcome as Egypt, Jordan, the UAE, Bahrain, Morocco, and possibly Saudi coming up.
It's so great. It's like all these countries you wanted it. What's so funny about the world is all of these countries were so upset throughout history of having Jews there, right? Because we moved to the top of government. A lot of us were very successful. They hated us for it, were envious of us for it, and said, "Go back to where you came from." We go back to where we came from, and now they're like, "Well, we don't really want you there either." It's like, where should we go? The moon? So if you dismantle Israel, and you don't kill every single Jew living there, we're going to have to go back to all these countries that we were initially lived in, and then you don't want us there either. So I guess that only means one thing. I guess you just want to kill all of us, because where else do we go?
Exactly. That's the implicit. That's 100% the implicit statement that's being made there, for sure. I mean, it's very much a part of anti-Semitic thought. The Jews are the enemy of the white European race, and they're the whitest of all whites. The Jew is the capitalist and the communist and the nefarious actors behind socialism. The Jews responsible for religious fundamentalism and the porn industry. There's all these different things. Depends who you are, the Jew is responsible for it. So it's the same thing. Go back to where you came from, but you're also the colonizers of that very same place who has no right to be there.
This is crazy, bro. We can't. We can't. Yeah.
Or some invocation of morality or justice that's going to extricate us from this conflict. It's going to take some actual difficult political maneuvering on the ground.
Of accepting Israel.
Which
they formally did in 1993.
Which they formally did in 1993, yeah, but then no lasting peace came after that in 2000.
No, because 1993 was not a peace agreement.
Sure, the Oslo Accords
were an interim agreement. And Palestinians actually began clamoring for commencing the permanent status resolutions on schedule. And the Israelis kept delaying them. In fact, they only began, I believe, in 99 under American pressure on the Israelis.
I think of being a bit one-sided. Both sides didn't fulfill the promise of Oslo and the steps needed for Oslo, there was Palestinian terrorism, which accompanied Israel's expansion of settlements and other things. The two things fed each other and led to what happened in 2000, which was a breakdown of the talks altogether when the Palestinians said no. But I think I don't agree incidentally with this definition of Israel or the Israeli state as apartheid. It's not. There is some sort of apartheid going on in the West Bank. The Israeli regime itself is not an apartheid regime. That's nonsense. By any definition of apartheid.
Well, by the formal definition, I think it qualifies.
No, it doesn't qualify. Apartheid is a race-based distinction between different segments of the population, and some of them don't have any representation at all, like the blacks in South Africa. No rights at all. In Israel itself, the minorities, the Arabs, do have representation, do have rights, and so on. I don't think Israel is also genocidal. I don't think it's been genocidal. It wasn't so in 48, it wasn't so in 67, and it hasn't been recently, in my view. And talk about dismantling Israel, and that's what you're talking about, is, I think Stephen said it correctly, is counterproductive. It just pushes Israelis further away from willing to give Palestinians anything.
Please, Norm, tell me you have
something
optimistic to say.
Even though I agree, I've thought about it a lot, and I agree with Muin's analysis. I'm not really in the business of punditry. I'd rather look at the historical record where I feel more comfortable, and I feel on terra firma. So I'd like to just go through that. I agree and I disagree with Muin on the 73 issue. After the 1973 war, it was clear that Israel was surprised by what happened during the war, and it took a big hit. The estimates are, I don't know what numbers you use, but I hear between 2,000 and 3,000 Israeli soldiers were killed during the
2,500?
Yeah, 2,700.
Yeah, okay, so I got it right. I read different numbers. That's, it's a very large number of Israelis who were killed. There were moments at the beginning of the war where there was a fear that this might be it.
There wasn't. No, everybody forgets Israel's atomic weapon.
I know, but
so how could they be defeated?
Didn't Dayan talk about the collapse of the third temple?
He did, but it was hysterical and silly. Because Israel had atomic weapons. They wanted to stop the Syrians or the Egyptians.
We're talking about perception.
I'm not. I can't tell you if he was hysterical or not.
No, he was.
In the same room with him. But I'm just saying, let's not bog down on that. The war is over, and when President Carter comes into power, Carter was an extremely smart guy, Jimmy Carter, extremely smart guy, and he was very fixed on details. He was probably the most impressive of modern American presidents, in my opinion, by a wide margin. And he was determined to resolve the conflict on a big scale, on the Arab-Israeli scale. On the Palestinian issue, he wouldn't go past what he called the Palestinian homeland. He went
Palestinian national home.
The Palestinian national home. He wouldn't go as far as a Palestinian state. I'm not going to go into the details of that. I don't think realistically, given the political balance of forces, that was going to happen, but that's a separate issue. Let's get to the issue at hand, namely, what is the obstacle, what has been the obstacle since the early 1970s. Since roughly 1974, the Palestinians have accepted the two-state settlement in the June 1967 border. Now, as more pressure was exerted on Israel because the Palestinians seemed reasonable, the Israelis, to quote the Israeli political scientist Avner Yaniv, he since passed from the scene, he said, Yaniv in his book, Dilemmas of Security, he said that the big Israeli fear was what he called the Palestinian peace offensive. That was their worry, that the Palestinians were becoming too moderate. And unless you understand that, you can't understand the June 1982 Lebanon War. The purpose of the June 1982 Lebanon War was to liquidate the PLO in southern Lebanon because they were too moderate, the Palestinian peace offensive. I'm going to have to fast forward. There are many events. There's the first Intifada, then there's the Oslo Accord, and let's now go to the heart of the issue, namely the 2000-2001 negotiations. Well, the negotiations are divided into three parts for the sake of listeners. There's Camp David in July 2000. There are the Clinton parameters in December 2000. And then there are negotiations in Taba in Egypt in 2001. Those are the three phases. Now, I have studied the record probably to the point of insanity because there are so many details you have to master.
I'll vouch for that. Insanity.
Yeah, I will vouch for it. I will personally vouch for it. There is one extensive record from that whole period from 2000 to, you could say, 2007. And that is what came to be called the Palestine Papers, which were about 15,000 pages of all the records of the negotiations. I have read through all of them, every single page. And this is what I find. If you look at Shlomo Ben Ami's book, which I have with me, Prophets Without Honor, it's his last book. He says, going into Camp David, that means July, going into Camp David, July 2000, he said the Israelis were willing to will withdraw from 92% of the West Bank.
Ben Ami was at Camp David.
Yeah, he was at Taba. He was also at Camp David. Israel wanted to keep all the major settlement blocks. It wanted to keep roughly 8% of the West Bank. They were allowing for, you put it at 84 to 90% in your books. They put it at roughly 92%. Israel was
also depends how you calculate.
Yeah, it also depends what stage of Camp David, because there were 2 weeks.
I'll get to that.
Proposals changed during
So Israel wants to keep all the major settlement blocks.
Means the border area of the West Bank.
Well, not the border. We have Ariel. We have Male Adumim. We have, as Condoleezza Rice called Ariel, she said it was a dagger into the heart of the West Bank. So they want to keep 8% of the land. They want to keep the settlement blocks. They want to keep 80% of the settlers. They will not budge an inch on the question of refugees. To quote Ehud Barak in the article he co-authored with you in the New York Review of Books, we will accept, and I think the quote's accurate, no moral, legal, or historical responsibility for what happened to the refugees. So forget about even allowing refugees to return. We accept no moral, legal, or historical responsibility for the refugees. And on Jerusalem, they wanted to keep large parts of Jerusalem. Now, how do we judge who is reasonable and who is not? Ben Ami says, I think the Israeli offer was reasonable. That's how he sees it. But what is the standard of reasonable? My standard is, what does international law say? International law says the settlements are illegal. Israel wants to keep all the settlement blocks. 15 judges, all 15, in the Wool decision in 2004, in July 2004, all 15 judges, including the American judge Bergenthal, ruled the settlements are illegal under international law. They want to keep 80% of the settlers. Under international law, all the settlers are illegal in the West Bank. They want to keep large parts of East Jerusalem. But under international law, East Jerusalem is occupied Palestinian territory. That's what the international...
No, not Palestinian, because there was no Palestine.
Okay.
There's never been a Palestinian state. How could it be Palestinian?
I listened patiently to you.
Sorry.
Under international law, if you read the decision, all territory not 2004 wall decision, all territory beyond the Green Line, which includes East Jerusalem, is occupied Palestinian territory.
Except for the Golan Heights.
The designated unit, according to the International Court of Justice, the designated unit for Palestinian self-determination. And they deny any right whatsoever on the right of return. The maximum, I don't want to go into the details now, the maximum formal offer was by Ehud Olmert in 2008. He offered 5,000 refugees could return under what was called family reunification, 5,000 in the course of 5 years, and no recognition of any Israeli responsibility. So if you use as the baseline what the UN General Assembly has said and what the International Court of Justice has said, if you use that baseline, international law, by that baseline, all the concessions came from the Palestinian side. Every single concession came from the Palestinian side.
I just want to quickly interject here, and I say, no matter how extreme this might sound, when you wage a war against the Jews and you tell the Palestinians to leave, and once Israel is defeated, you can come back, and now you want this law of return, you forfeited that right. That's as far as I'm concerned. If I was an Israeli leader, I'd say, this supposed return you're looking for, well, you should have stayed. You shouldn't have been so confident that you were going to defeat all of us, leave and come back, and now you want to be a sore loser, essentially.
Yeah, well, the idea of return in the context of the Palestinians, it's interesting because Norman's speaking about international law and then speaking about the return, but there's no actual international legal precedent for the idea of return in what the Palestinians are claiming. There's now a sovereign country that exists in a part of the land. It's acknowledged by international law on the 1967 borders. That's the state of Israel. The Palestinians have no right of return into sovereign Israel. So, Norm is saying certain things according to international law, and he's largely correct on the things in which he's saying, especially the wall conclusions in 2004. Whether one chooses to agree with those conclusions or not is a separate issue, but he's correct on what the conclusions were. But he's using international law and then negating the idea that the one thing he's advocating for that he says is unreasonable not to grant is not accepted, or there's no international standard for it in international law itself. So that should be a thing. Secondly, Rabbani also spoke about return. Again, this is the topic that keeps recurring, keeps coming back, keeps coming back, keeps coming back. And there's a reason it keeps coming back. It's, as we know from the record, which they're aware of, so I'm not sure why it's not coming up, is that the Palestinians largely walked away from the peace deals based on the fact that there was no return. They're saying that Israel claimed no moral or legal responsibility for the refugees. Anyway, the bottom line of what I'm trying to say is that if you are accepting at baseline the two-state solution is based off a very simple context of two states for two peoples, where in this context, the one is a Jewish state known as the State of Israel, and the other one is an Arab state for Arab people known as the State of Palestine, well, then return in and of itself as a concept violates all principles and understandings. In fact, it's totally contradictory to the idea of return, because return ends up in practice with a Jewish minority in the supposed Jewish state. So then you don't actually have two states for two peoples. So this is the thing, while he's saying, well, Arafat officially recognized Israel in 1993 during the Oslo Accords, true. And then when it actually came to recognizing Israel as a Jewish state, meaning in two states for two peoples, he walked away in favor of return, which is the political program to turn the Jews into a minority in their own state. So no, the Palestinian leadership have never accepted a Jewish state in any part of the land.
Yep, 100%, because it all goes back to this, man. It's the idea of playing the chess game of acquiring more and more land until they're able to completely overthrow us, and that's it. That's just what it comes down to. We as Jews just live in this delusion. It's yeah.
None came from the Israeli side. They may have accepted less than what they wanted, but it was still beyond what international law allocated to them. Now, you say
allocated to the Palestinians.
Allocated to the Palestinians, yes. Thank you for the clarification. Now, about Arafat. Like the Mufti, never liked the guy. I think that was one of the only disagreements Mouin and I had when Arafat passed. You were a little sentimental, I was not. Never liked the guy. But politics, you don't have to like the guy. There was no question. Nobody argues it. That whenever the negotiations started up, the Palestinians just kept saying the same things. No. They kept saying no. No. Professor Morris, with due respect, incorrect. They kept saying international legitimacy, international law, UN resolutions. They said, we already gave you what the law required. We gave that in 1988, November 1988, and then ratified again at Oslo in 1993. And they said, now we want what was promised us under international law. And that was the one point where everybody on the other side agreed. Clinton, don't talk to me about international law. Livni, during the Omar administration, he said, I studied international law. I don't believe in international law. Every single member on the other side, they didn't want to hear from international law. And to my thinking, that is the only reasonable baseline for trying to resolve the conflict. And Israel has, along with the US.
When has international law been relevant to any conflict basically in the world?
That's why
over the last
that's why the Palestinians have to recognize Israel, because that's international law.
That was
UN Resolution 242.
By international law or in accordance with international law.
Professor Morris, for argument's sake, let's agree on that. Strictly for argument's sake. What's the alternative? Dennis Ross said, we're going to decide who gets what on the basis of needs. So he says, Israel needs this, Israel needs that, Israel needs that. Dennis Ross decided to be the philosopher king. He's going to decide on the basis of needs. Well, if you ask me, since Gaza is one of the densest places on earth, it needs a nice big chunk
of Sinai.
Well, not Sinai.
That's what it actually needs.
Okay, I don't even want to go there. It needs a nice big chunk.
That's what I say. That's what I say. I think, first of all, Jordan should absolve all of them. And then if they stop committing terror, allow them to come and work, allow them to visit Jerusalem. Yeah, you're not going to have Palestine. Deal with it. Too bad. Too bad. We're not leaving. We're not going anywhere. Or let Egypt give them some of the Sinai. What the hell what are they doing with it anyway? I don't even know what they're doing with the Sinai. Are they doing anything with the Sinai?
Not much. You can go there. There's little beach resorts. That's about it.
So give some of them. Give some of the Sinai to them. We are not giving them more Gaza. We have a tiny little country. Enough already. Egypt has a massive piece of nothing land, because that's what they do. Of course, there's nothing there, pretty much. So give the Palestinians some of Sinai. If Jordan won't accept them, I think Jordan was supposed to be the Palestinian state anyway. But if Jordan's not going to accept more Palestinians, and Egypt, in Egypt proper, isn't going to accept more Palestinians, so give them some Sinai then.
I have to accept international law says no. Okay,
international law is irrelevant.
Now, Benjamin says, I think the Israeli offer was reasonable. Okay, that's reasonable. He seems that, even though, okay, I don't want to go there. I've debated him, and partly agree with you. But who decides what's reasonable? I think the international community, in its political incarnation, the General Assembly, the Security Council, all those UN Security Council resolutions saying the settlements are illegal, annexation of East Jerusalem is null and void, and the International Court of Justice. That, to me, is a reasonable standard. And by that standard, the Palestinians were asked to make concessions, which I consider unreasonable, or the international community considers unreasonable.
I think the issue is when you apply international law or international standards, I wouldn't say what Benny Moore says that they're irrelevant, but I think that these have to be seen as informing the conversation. I don't think these are the final shape of the conversation. I don't think historically Israel has ever negotiated within these strict bounds, whether we're talking Resolution 242, whether we're talking about any General Assembly resolutions. That's just not how these negotiations tend to go. You might consider international opinion on things, but at the end of the day, it's the bilateral negotiations, oftentimes historically started in secret, independent of the international community, that end up shaping what the final agreements look like. I think the issue with this broad appeal to international law is, again, going back to my earlier point about all the euphemistic words, all it simply does is drive Palestinian expectations up to a level that is never going to be satisfied. For instance, you can throw that ICJ opinion all you want. It was an advisory opinion. That came in 2004. Palestinians gained more or less land since that 2004 advisory opinion was issued.
So what would your standard be then?
Both sides have to have a delegation that confronts each other, and they assess the realistic conditions on the ground, and they try to figure out within the confines of international law what both sides are reasonable for. But like, for instance, this statement of like full retreat from the West Bank, was it 400,000 settlers? How many settlers in the West Bank now?
Probably half a million. Depends if you include the Jerusalem suburbs.
Yeah, 400,000 or 500,000 people are never.
With the Jerusalem suburbs, perhaps.
Sure.
Yeah. Israel calls Jerusalem, not settlements.
I know that, but that's not what the law calls it null and void.
We can say where we want to blue in the face, but like there's half a million Israeli people not being expelled.
My response, you're basically saying, if I understand correctly, there's only one way to resolve this, and that is through direct bilateral negotiation.
Probably, yeah.
Okay. So
or ideally, but
I've taken over your house. Okay. You're not going to go to the police because, you know, the law is only of limited value. So you come over and sit in what is now my living room that used to be your living room, and we negotiate. The problem there is that you're not going to get anything unless I agree to it. And standards and norms and law and all the rest of it be damned. So you need to take into account that when you're advocating bilateral negotiations, that effectively that gives each of the parties veto power. And in the current circumstances, the Palestinians have already recognized Israel. They have.
But you keep bringing that up like it's a significant concession.
It's not even true.
It doesn't, the recognition from Palestine isn't doing anything for.
Hamas totally rejects.
I'm not talking about
Hamas is the majority among the Palestinian people. They won the elections in 2006.
They're not recognizing Israel by any standard. They're doing it through their actions. And I don't care what they write down or what they claim. It's all the actions that matter.
Actually, they won the majority of the seats.
Yes, exactly. Every opinion poll today says the majority of Palestinians support the Hamas. Hamas absolutely rejects Israel. So if Arafat in 1993 or whatever issued a sort of recognition of Israel, okay, a recognition of Israel, it's meaningless. It's meaningless. Anyhow, I don't believe that Arafat was sincere about it.
Doesn't matter what you or I think.
Well, most Israelis do, and that does matter.
Okay,
so but Hamas says no, and Hamas is the majority.
So for years, the Israeli and U.S. demand was that the Palestinians recognize 242 and 338. They did, but you're saying, okay, we demanded that they do this, but it was meaningless when they did it. Then the demand was that
tactical thing. Yes.
Then the demand was that the PLO recognize Israel.
Yeah, that's Benny Morris is saying exactly what I'm saying. He's elaborating and saying it very eloquently, but he's saying exactly what I'm saying.
Okay, we demanded that they did this, and they did it, but it's meaningless.
And they never changed their charter, the PLO. You may remember that.
In fact,
they supposedly abrogated the old charter, but never came up with a new one.
No,
so no new charter.
But in 1996.
And Farouk Kaddoumi said, of course, the old charter is still in force.
Yes.
Because unlike a lot of Western countries, as Jews, we're so used to being killed, murdered, tortured, kicked out, removed. We know deep down, and it isn't even something we need to know deep down, we know what they really want to do. And so we want to work out a resolution, but we're afraid, and we know that realistically it's a chess game to further the agenda of eliminating the Jewish state.
Mhm.
It's very hard for us to just blatantly go for us to just go, you know what, let's do it, let's work it out, because in the back of our minds we go, wait a minute.
Well, yeah, I mean, peace is always optimal, but self-sacrifice is not.
The point is, the Palestinians, demands are constantly made of them, and when they accede to those demands, they're then told actually what you did is meaningless. So here's a new set of demands. I mean, it's like a hamster. It's like a hamster.
Let me tell you what
that will be told if you run fast enough, you'll get out of the cage.
No. The bottom line is that Israel would like a Palestinian Sadat. It wants the Palestinians. Listen, just
really worst case scenario.
Okay, let me just, because they shot Sadat. But anyhow, the Israelis want the Palestinians to actually accept the legitimacy of the state of Israel and the Zionist project, and then live side by side with them in two states. That's what the Israelis. I don't even know if that's true today.
And what is the foreign position of this Israeli government?
No, I'm saying I don't know if
it's predecessor. Come on.
That's what Israelis want. They want a change of psyche among the Palestinians. And if that doesn't happen, there won't be a Palestinian state.
Muin has an interesting point because I know you want to forget it, just like you want to forget the genocide charge. I know you want to forget that.
Well, Palestinians want to forget it too.
No, I love how Norman tries to do that. He tries to play off on that verbiage, right? Because he says forget international law. Benny Morris isn't saying forget international law. He's saying that in this case, in this instance, international law is not the priority here. It's understanding the pragmatism of what's going on. And he just grabs that what he says and he runs with it. It's like that. You're not listening to the nuance.
That's debate style, of course.
He loves doing that.
Okay, but here's the problem, and it's exactly the problem that Muin just brought up. Now, I read carefully your book, One State, Two States. With all due respect, absolutely a disgrace. Coming from you.
Most reviewers didn't agree with you.
Yeah, coming from you was like you wrote it in your sleep. It's nothing compared to what you wrote before. I don't know why you did it. In my opinion, you ruined your reputation. Not totally, but you undermined it with that book. But let's get to the issue that Muin wrote. Here's what you said. You said, formally, you said, yes, it's true. The Palestinians recognize Israel. But then you said, viscerally, in their hearts, they didn't really recognize Israel. So I thought to myself, how does Professor Morris know what's in the hearts of Palestinians? I don't know. I was surprised as a historian you would be talking about what's lurking in the hearts of Palestinians. But then you said something which is really interesting. You said, even if in their hearts they accepted Israel, you said, quote, rationally, they could never accept Israel because they got nothing. They had this beautiful Palestine, and now they're reduced to just a few parcels of land.
So they will never accept it.
So you said, there's no way they can accept it.
I would say that as well.
Yeah, exactly as Muin said, you keep moving the goalposts until we reach the point where we realize, according to Benny Morris, there can't be a solution. So why don't you just say that outright? Why don't you say it outright? That according to you, the Palestinians can never be reasonable because according to you,
they want all of Palestine.
According to you, they couldn't possibly agree to a two-state settlement because it's such a lousy settlement. That's what you said. Because you said rationally they couldn't accept it, not their feelings. You said rational. You went from
no, it's not lousy. It's actually something that no other country would ever give, other than us to an extent, us morons as Jews. I'm saying is because in any other predicament, they would have been completely wiped out. And now we're trying to make it work after they tried to annihilate us on multiple occasions alongside the other Arab armies. And now Norman is saying, oh, you keep moving the goalposts. It's like, no, because we know what they really want.
Well,
formally,
also,
differently, rationally.
Go ahead.
Yeah, no, I'm just going to say that if you offer a peace deal and the response is rejection and an initiation of aggression, which is exactly what followed the Palestinian rejection of Camp David, the waging of the Second Intifada. This is what happens. And this is actually, this is a good opportunity to speak about this. This is a fundamental flaw in Israeli-Palestinian diplomacy. There's it's kind of a 101 standard in conflict resolution, something that everyone would learn in their first semester studying conflict resolution. Incentive and deterrence is essentially what it is. Incentivization for peace, which leads to a deterrence of further war. Now, how do you incentivize peace? By saying what is on the table now is the best you're going to get. Accept it. That, if you know that that is the best deal you're getting and you accept it, there will not be war. But what has happened in the peace processes with the Israelis and the Palestinians? For every Palestinian rejection since Camp David in 2000, the next offer that was put on the table was more favorable for the Palestinians, less favorable for the Israelis. That sends a clear message that there's no incentivization for peace and no deterrence for war. Because with each rejection and pursuit of violence on the part of the Palestinians, they get a better deal. And if we can acknowledge that the course is from the river to the sea, they'll keep rejecting and keep pursuing violence to get better deals. On the flip side, the winning side, if you want to put it that way, the state of Israel, instead of seeking peace and accepting peace, will seek to maintain the status quo. So if the losing side gets better deals with each rejection and pursuit of violence, they'll keep rejecting and pursuing violence. If the winning side gets worse terms by making peace than maintaining the status quo, they'll seek to maintain the status quo. That is the fundamental flaw in Palestinian-Israeli peace diplomacy. And it has been so fundamentally flawed and totally abandoned at every single aspect of this.
That is so, and all of this is happening because the Israeli side is unwilling, unfortunately, because it's very hard to do with such a small number of people. We're afraid. We are afraid of losing Israel, and so we're tiptoeing around it. We have an enemy that wants to defeat us, and at some point we're going to have to. Even saying this, right? I'm a young guy, and I have a lot to learn. But the more I grow older and I grow wiser, I just realize that if they will not accept the state of Israel, they are going to have to either leave or they're going to have to be killed. There's nothing else to do. There's nothing else to do. There's no other way. If you won't accept our sovereignty and you keep fighting us, then what is there to do? You need to either accept Gaza as your state, or we will have to defeat you. There's nothing else. There's nothing else to do.
Well, maybe byproduct of a result. I wouldn't say that should be the Israeli leading principle, nor should I say it should be policy. I think the Israeli policy and the leading principle shouldn't be that. But maybe as a result of more wars, that would be an outcome that would happen. But I think it's not just the Israelis who see things that way. In fact, I'd say that most Israelis after Camp David will be able to acknowledge, maybe not say it in the exact way in which I'm saying it, but they'd be able to say what I'm saying. It's really actually the Americans and the diplomatic, I call them the industrial peace complex, who have totally neglected and abandoned any form of conflict resolution, except an alerted opinion on conflict resolution. So, if the Americans are going to continue to put themselves in the chief operating chair of the peace negotiations, they'll need to go back to their textbooks from Conflict Resolution 101, Semester 1, and understand the basic principle of incentivization and deterrence. I don't think that there's going to be a possibility of that, because on the one hand, those who led those negotiations, they brought up Dennis Ross. Dennis Ross will admit that today. Dennis Ross actually happens to be a colleague of mine at the institute that I work at. When I say a colleague, meaning he's the co-chair, so he's more my boss than a colleague, if we're putting it correct. But Aaron David Miller, another one who was involved in the negotiations, will admit the same thing today. When I look at the diplomacy in the American peace camp, I see the change in certain aspects, and that they're willing to go through the multilateral route, maybe through Saudi and through the region. I really do think that is the only way to get to any sort of settlement, because at the end of the day, the Palestinians look at a map. They don't see the state of Israel in its borders, in its recognized borders of 67, and themselves in the West Bank and Gaza as the conflict. They zoom out. They see 6 to 7 million Jews among 500 million Arabs, 1.5 billion Muslims, and conclude that time is on their side. It's only a matter of waiting it out. Keep rejecting, keep pursuing violence. That is a fundamental mistake that the Palestinians keep making. But that is ultimately what they see. And it is only at the point where the Palestinians realize that the region, those 500 million Arabs, are actually no longer with them. And it doesn't need to be the whole region. You'll still have Iraq, Iran, and Syria, and parts of Lebanon. But ultimately, once the Saudis fall in line with the peace deal that comes with concessions to the Palestinians, because that will be part of it, then Oman and Kuwait and all these other countries fall in line behind Saudi. And once that happens, you've essentially created the environment where that rejectionism and that mentality towards peace no longer actually has any sort of place to draw energy from, because there's no energy being given to it. The energy is being pushed by the Arab world in the opposite direction. Do as Sadat did, do as we're doing, accept the legitimacy of the state of Israel as a Jewish state in a part of the land, Otherwise, X, Y, and Z. That is the only way we get to peace. It's not through bilateral negotiations with the Palestinians. In fact, I don't even think it's through bilateral negotiations led by an American camp. It's going to be, America will be involved in it, Israelis and Palestinians will be involved in it, but it will be multilateral and it will likely come through the region. If there's a possibility to peace, that's the way in which it will come.
I think that makes sense. I think that makes a lot of sense.
Now we're reaching the point where, according to Benny Morris, the Palestinians can't be reasonable because reasonably they have to reject two states.
They want all of
Louis is
Palestine.
absolutely correct. There's no way to resolve the problem according to your logic.
He said that himself. He said they should dismantle Israel.
I'm
That's what he said.
What I said,
You didn't say that.
what I said, and I've written.
I'm glad you didn't deny it.
I've written extensively on this issue, on why a two-state settlement is still feasible, and I came out in support of that proposition. Perhaps in my heart, you can see that I was just bullshitting, but that's what I actually wrote. That was a number of years ago, and just as a matter of historical record, beginning in the early 1970s, there was fierce debate within the Palestinian national movement about whether to accept or reject. And there were three schools of thought. There was one that would accept nothing less than the total liberation of Palestine. There was a second that accepted what was called the establishment of a fighting national authority on Palestinian soil, which they saw as as a springboard for the total liberation of Palestine. And there was a third school that believed that under current dynamics and so on, that they should go for a two-state settlement. And our friend and correspondent, Wouter Loerse, has written a very perceptive article on when the PLO, already in 1976, came out in open support of a two-state resolution at the Security Council. PLO accepted it. Israel, of course, rejected it. But the resolution didn't pass because the US and the UK vetoed it. It was both of them.
I think it was 9-5.
Okay, yeah. But the fact of the matter is that the PLO came to accept a two-state settlement. Why they did it, I think, is irrelevant. And subsequently, the PLO acted on the basis of seeking to achieve a two-state settlement. The reason, I think, and I think, Norm, you've written about this, the reason that Arafat was so insistent on getting the minimally acceptable terms for a two-state settlement at Camp David and afterwards was precisely because he knew that once he signed, that was all the Palestinians were going to get. If his intention had been, I'm not accepting Israel, I simply want a springboard, he would have accepted a Palestinian state in Jericho. But he didn't. He
That's
insisted.
something I never understood. He should have logically accepted the springboard and then from there launched his next stage.
You don't understand.
He should have done that.
International law would put a real constraint on him.
No, but
once
also,
he accepted, it was over.
Constitutionally, he was incapable of signing.
Well,
I don't know that.
if
You're
that's,
right. That he should have accepted it.
But if you're correct, okay, that he was really out to eliminate Israel, then he wouldn't have cared about the borders. He wouldn't have cared about what the thing said about refugees. He would have gotten a sovereign state and used that to achieve that purpose. But I think it was precisely because he recognized that he was not negotiating for a springboard. He was negotiating permanent status, that he was such a stickler about the details. The second,
just as a factual matter, he wasn't such a stickler. When they asked him how many refugees, the numbers
as the principle rather than
the principle.
He said I would be pragmatic about it.
Yes, and the numbers that were used at Annapolis were between 100 and 250,000 refugees over 10 years. That was the number. Arafat, when he was asked at Camp David, he kept saying, I care about the Lebanese Palestinian refugees in Lebanon, which came to about 300,000, which was a large concession from, whether you accept the number or not, that he wasn't talking about 6 million. He was talking about between 100 and 250,000 over 10 years. Now, the best offer that came from the Palestinians, the best offer that came from Israel was the Olmert offer.
Can we just pretend like we didn't all lay out the exceptionally pessimistic view of a two-state, hold on a second, two-state solution? Let's pretend that in 5 years and 10 years, a two-state peace settlement is reached. And as historians, you will still be here writing about it 20 years from now. How would it have happened?
I think that historically, I think that the big issue is, I think that both sides have had their own internal motivations to fight because they feel like they have something to gain from it. But I think as time has gone on, unfortunately, the record proves that the Palestinian side is delusional. The longer that the conflict endures, the worse position they'll be in. But for some reason, they've never had a leader that convinced them of that as much. That Arafat thought that if he held on, there was always a better deal around the corner. Abbas is more concerned with trying to maintain any legitimacy amongst Palestinians than actually trying to negotiate anything realistic with Israel. That Palestinians are always incentivized to feel like as long as they keep fighting, either the international community is going to save them with the 5 millionth UN resolution condemning whatever, then another ICJ advisory opinion is finally going to lead to the expulsion of 500,000 Jews from the West Bank, or that some other international body, the ICJ and the genocide tries to come save the Palestinians. As long as they, in their mind, feel like somebody is coming to save them, then they feel like they're going to have the ability to get something better in the future. But the reality is all of the good partners for peace that the Palestinians have completely and utterly abandoned them. Egypt, Jordan, the Gulf states, whether you're talking bilateral peace, the Abraham Accords, most of the Arab leaders in negotiating peace with Israel have just not had as much of an interest in maintaining the rights and the representations of what Palestinian people want. And the only people they have today to draw legitimacy from or to have on their side to argue with them are people that I guess write books or tweet, or people in the international community that do resolutions or Amnesty International reports. And the reality is we can scream until we're blue in the face on these things. None of it has gotten any closer to helping the Palestinians in any sense of the word. The conditions only got worse. The settlements only continue to expand. The military operations are only going to get more brutal. The blockade is going to continue to have worse effects. As long as we use international law as the basis, and there isn't a strong Sadat-like Palestinian leader that's willing to come up and confront Israel with the brave peaceful negotiations to force them to acquiesce, nothing's going to happen. And I think that the issue you come up with is, whether it's people like Norm that talk about how brave the October 7th attacks were, how much respect they have for those fighters, Israel, in a way, and I think people say so much about Netanyahu, the right wants violence from the Palestinians because it always gives them a perpetual excuse to further the conflict. Well, we have to go in October 7th, we've got room for Hamas. So we can't trust these people anymore. So we have to do the night raids because, the second Intifada, it made us feel like the Palestinian people didn't want to trust with us. I feel like the biggest thing that would force Israel to change its path would be an actual, a real, not for like 2 weeks, but an actual peaceful Palestinian leader, somebody committed to peace that is able to apply those standards and hold the entire region of Palestine to those standards. Because I think over time, the mounting pressure from without the international community and the mounting pressure from within, because Israel hosts a lot of its own criticism. We talk about B'Tselem, Israel hosts a lot of its own criticism. I think that pressure would force Israel towards an actual peace agreement, but it's never going to come through violence. Historically, it hasn't. And in the modern day, violence has just hurt the Palestinians more and more.
If you paint a picture of the future, now is a good moment for both Palestine and Israel to get new leadership. Netanyahu's on the way out. Hamas possibly is on the way out. Who should rise to the top? such that a peaceful settlement can be reached.
The problem is, like Danny said, it's difficult because Hamas enjoys so much widespread support amongst the Palestinian people. I think that I don't know, there's opinions on whether democracy or pushing them towards elections was the right or wrong idea, but with like an Islamic fundamentalist government for Hamas, I don't know if a negotiation with Israel ever happens there. And then when the international pressure is always, 67 borders, infinite right of return for refugees, and a total withdrawal of Israel from all these lands to even start negotiations, I just don't see realistically that on the Palestinian side, no negotiations are ever going to start in a place that Israel's willing to accept.
If you want to dismiss international law, that's fine, but then you have to do it consistently. You can't set standards for the Palestinians, but reject applying those standards to Israel. If we're going to have the law of the jungle, then we can all be beasts, and not only some of us. And I think, so it's either that, or you have certain agreed standards that are intended to regulate our conduct, all of our conduct, not just some of us.
Well,
so that's a fundamental
saying to abandon.
Well, you're saying, international law and the millionth UN resolution, you're being very dismissive about all
Well,
these things. And that's fine, but then you have to be dismissive
like, for instance,
across the board.
That was a Chapter 6 resolution. That's non-binding. But 242 is
binding.
Absolutely not.
What is binding? Do you know anything about how the UN system
Binding,
works?
if you read the language of the resolution, binding is typically the commits you to uphold particular international law, which
What is
establishes a new
Chapter
rule.
6? You just throw out words. You hear binding,
Does
not binding.
242 mention a Palestinian state?
No,
Of course
that's
not.
part of the problem.
That was the reason why Palestinians didn't want to recognize 242, because it only referred at the very end.
Sure,
to
but
the
they
refugee
recognize
problem.
181 and 242.
Yeah, but hold on. Every United Nations Security Council resolution, irrespective of under which chapter it was adopted, is by definition binding. Binding not only on the members of the Security Council, but on every member state of the UN. Read the UN Charter. It's black and white.
Sure,
Okay. Now regarding
the language even of 242 is kept intentionally vague, such that it doesn't actually provide again the
it's
final
actually not
contours.
that vague because the term land for peace originates in 242.
Sure,
The idea is
territorial acquisition, and Israel needs to give it up. Was kept vague.
Okay.
That's why 79
you
Israel saw the
asked
other obligations under
Allow me
242
points of
in terms of withdrawal.
information. Allow me points of information. The first principle in UN Resolution 242 is the inadmissibility of the acquisition of territory by force.
Which is meaningless.
It may be meaningless to you, Mr.
It's
Bernal.
meaningless.
Okay, Mr. Bernal. That principle was adopted by the Friendly Nations Resolution, the UN General Assembly in 1970. That resolution was then reiterated in the International Court of Justice, this ruling, advisory opinion in 2004. That was the basis of the coalition against Iraq when it acquired Kuwait and then declared it a province of Kuwait.
No, which Iraq supported.
That's what's called. That's
That's
called.
true.
Under,
That's what I did support. That's why
I'm
you
not,
should
it's not,
illegal
it's not,
outlaws.
I'm not going to go there. I'm not going to go there.
It's not after the Arab endorsed.
Okay, I'm not going to go there.
Okay.
It's called under international law, use Kogan's or peremptory norms of international law, the inadmissibility of the acquisition of territory by war. That is not controversial. It's not vague. You couldn't put it more succinctly. You cannot acquire territory by force under international law.
On the website before 67. Who acquired before 67?
Mr. Bernal, don't change the subject. If you don't know what you're talking about, at least have the humility. You talk about chapter 6. You don't know chapter 6. You don't know chapter 6 from tweet 5. You have no idea what you're talking about. It's just so embarrassing. At least have some humility. Between us, we've read maybe 10,000 books on the topic, and you've read 2 Wikipedia entries, and you start talking about chapter 6. You know what chapter 7 is? You know what chapter 7 is?
How close is 242 gotten the Palestinians to a state?
You know,
How close is the 2004 advisory opinion gotten the West Bank settlement?
what's your alternative?
The alternative is not this, whatever this making money off the conflict is. The actual alternative. The actual
That's the
alternative.
you should talk about making money off of idiocy.
You don't talk to 50 million other people.
Your
You're
earlier
awesome.
But he has a point.
The issue is you have
All
to
these
negotiate.
resolutions have gotten the Palestinians no closer to a state.
Because they haven't been enforced because of the U.S. veto.
They're not going to be enforced.
Wait.
Okay.
No,
If I may.
You know what, Professor Morris?
The case for genocide.
Professor Morris, because of your logic, and I'm not disputing it, that's why October 7th happened.
Oh my God.
Because there was no options left for those people. Exactly what
And
Maureen
now what
said.
options are left after
No,
October 7th?
listen to this.
That's so crazy. There were no options left for them. So that's what you do, thinking that that's going to get you further?
Yeah.
No,
Well,
it's not.
Go ahead.
no, this is the mentality. That's all I was going to say.
The what?
The mentality. That's the mentality. That's all I was going to say.
An expert on Palestinian mentality.
You're contradicting
You know
yourself.
about Palestinian mentality.
I will
Chapter
chapter 5.
5.
Egypt didn't find it necessary. Egypt didn't find it necessary to negotiate peace with the Palestinians. Jordan didn't find it necessary to negotiate peace with the
If I may,
Palestinians. You're contradicting all of the international law.
Everybody, wait. You're contradicting yourself. On the one hand, you're saying all the Palestinians do is fight and violence and terrorism and all the rest of it. But on the other hand, you're saying they're expecting salvation from UN resolutions and international courts. Those aren't violent.
No, that's part of maintaining. It's the continual putting off of negotiating and a solution.
They've negotiated.
I think when Eric
I think he said
to respond,
I think he said they accepted 2 states in 1975. Brace yourself. That's 50 years ago. That's a half century ago.
No, they didn't accept the 2 state
He
solution.
quoted a very good article.
You can quote Arafat talking about how he's lying and he's just going to use in 94 and 95. He's making sure
But there's a very rich
starting ground. I'm sorry. You can watch it slow down to 0.5 speed. You don't understand what I'm saying.
There's a very lengthy history of Israeli-Palestinian negotiations. You want to deny that those negotiations took place?
Where it feels like there was a good faith effort. Where there was a good faith effort. Where it was a good faith effort. With all due
We have
respect,
a written
Mr.
record,
Pop historian,
Mr.
you can't even read the written record. I don't know why you're first.
Excuse me, I just said there are 15,000 pages on Annapolis.
And I'm sure you cherry-picked your favorite quote
I
from
know
all of
every
them.
bit.
Okay, that's great. That's
Mr.
great.
Burrell, at
Yeah.
least I had a quote to cherry
That's
pick.
great.
All you have
And
is Wikipedia.
I gave you
All
quotes.
you have is
I gave you
Wikipedia.
quotes. Finding the implications that the Palestinian cause has been furthered by international law. You can't do it.
I think the problem is different. Okay, you want to say the Palestinians were only fighting, and then when I point out they've also gone to the court, and you want to say, well, all they do then is these things, and you say they should be negotiating, and I demonstrate that there was a lengthy record of negotiations. Said, yeah, but they didn't go in good faith. Again, you're placing the hamster in the wheel and telling him if he runs fast enough, maybe one day he'll get out of the cage.
What was the best
Okay, please, if I could just finish. I think the fundamental problem here is not what the Palestinians have and haven't done, and it's perfectly legitimate to have a discussion about whether they could have been more effective. Of course, they could have been more effective. Everyone could have always been more effective. The fundamental issue here is that Israel has never been prepared to concede the legitimacy of Palestinian national rights in the land of the former British Mandate of Palestine.
How do you explain Taba Summit? How do you explain the
No,
Camp
but
David?
Olmert did
How do you
accept
explain
the
Open
legitimacy
Hamas?
of Palestinian demands. This is,
Well,
but they didn't want to give the Palestinians all of Palestine. That's all.
No, all of Palestine.
All of
You mean all of the
Palestine.
occupied territories?
You're talking about all of Palestine.
Wait, what is the occupied? What is the occupied territories?
The occupied
All of
territories.
Israel?
The occupied territories are those territories that Israel occupied in June of 1967.
Palestinians often use that term to define the whole of Palestine, not just the West Bank.
Can you show me, Professor Morris, in all the negotiations, and all the accounts that have been written, can you show me one where the Palestinians in the negotiations, because that's what we were talking about, wanted all of Israel? The maximum.
You can't say that because international community won't accept it.
So they didn't say it, they didn't ask for it.
No, Hamas did. Hamas always said all of it.
Hamas only negotiated with Israel about prisoner exchanges.
Yeah, I know,
So
but
we're
they
not talking
represent
about
a lot of the Palestinian people will agree.
The only place I saw pieces of Israel were the land swaps, and the land swaps accounted for about 2 to 5% of Israel. Nobody asked for all of Israel.
What do you mean? They asked for all of Israel in 48. They asked for all of Israel in 67. What do you think the wars were about? You're not going to respond to anything I'm saying. You have no answer. That's correct.
That's really crazy that Norm's not giving Destiny any respect because he's younger and he feels he doesn't know enough. But he's making a very valid point. He's like, no, they're showing it through their actions of war that they're not willing to accept it. That's all the proof you need.
Well, yeah, it's the arguments of like male authority, what they call it, right? Is that, well, I have expertise in this, therefore you don't know what you're talking about, rather than arguing based on the point in which someone's bringing up. Because, I have my expertise on the conflict and on things, but I often have conversations with the everyday person on the street, and sometimes there's enlightening things that are brought up, right?
It's like saying you're not as old and wise as me, so you automatically, anything you say is irrelevant. And he's asking him perfectly logical questions, and all he's doing is resorting to ad hominem attacks of his idiocy when he's not answering his questions.
Well, there's a reason he's doing that, but he's not answering the question because the questions are actually quite rational and reasonable.
Right. He doesn't have answers to them. That's the reality.
There's no answers to them other than saying, well, they rejected them outright. And, you can dance around the at bottom, which Finkelstein likes to say. You can dance around that as much as you want, but the historical record, as they keep speaking about, is quite explicitly clear. There were concrete offers on the table, and the Palestinians walked away from all of them.
Okay, Mr. Bennell, we were talking about the diplomatic negotiations beginning with 2000, 2001.
You can't pretend that the first task for Israel was in diplomacy.
Okay.
It was the war.
You don't know what you're talking about.
Is the international law argument ever going to get the Palestinians closer to state? Is the Israeli state ever going to be dismantled? Do you think that's like realistic coming up ever in the next 20 years?
Again, I'm posing a question. And the question is, regardless of what's feasible or realistic today, the question I'm posing is, can you have peace in the Middle East with this militant, irrational, genocidal, apartheid state and power?
Hamas, I don't think so, no.
Okay, and the question I'm asking is, can you have peace with this regime, or does this regime and its institutions need to be dismantled, similar to what the examples I gave of Europe and Southern Africa?
How do you contend with the fact that most of the surrounding Arab states seem to agree that you can?
Yeah, you're correct. Several of them, most importantly Egypt, Jordan, have made their peace with Israel. I should add that Israel's conduct since then has placed these relations under strain. I had very little, I didn't
Clearly not after Iran's attack.
Exactly.
take the reports of a Saudi-Israeli rapprochement particularly seriously before October 7th, the reason being that it was really a Saudi-Israeli-US deal, which committed the US to make certain commitments to Saudi Arabia that would probably never get through Congress.
Do you not consider the Egypt-Israeli peace deal legitimate then, since the United States made a great financial contribution to Egypt?
I don't think the question is whether that deal is legitimate or not. I think that deal exists. But the point is whether the core of this conflict is not between Israel and Egypt. The core of this conflict is between Israel and the Palestinian people. And the reason that Israel agreed to relinquish the occupied Egyptian Sinai, and the reason that Egyptian-Israeli peace treaty was signed in 1979 is because Israel in 1973 recognized that its military superiority was ultimately no match for Egypt's determination to recover its occupied territories, and that there would come a point when Egypt would find a way to extract an unbearable
Maybe
price.
just Israelis wanted peace.
Well, the Israelis
not just because they were afraid what Egypt might do.
If you're talking about the average Israeli citizen, I think that's a fair characterization. If you're talking about the Israeli leadership, I think they looked at it in more strategic terms. How do you remove the most powerful military state?
Simple points. What was the terms of that Egypt-Israel peace treaty? International law. Egypt demanded
Nobody cared about international law.
allow me to finish. Every single inch
Nobody
of Egypt.
about international law. Begin and Carter and Saddam talked about the reality.
No, Professor Morris, I know the record. They demanded, as you know, because you've written about it, they demanded every square inch, as you know. They demanded the oil fields be dismantled.
No, that's in the
airfields.
No, not dismantled. They wanted the oil
And
field.
they wanted the settlements dismantled.
Yeah,
That was
dismantled.
the settlements, the oil fields, and the airfield. They demanded all three back. You can't have.
Back. The airfields weren't there.
Okay, that's incorrect.
What's-
You're incorrect. They built an
the
airfield. The Israelis built an airfield in the occupied Sinai,
Yes.
and they wanted it back.
They didn't want it back. It was theirs.
Okay.
They wanted the territory in which the airfield
Okay,
Israel had
okay.
built.
The oil fields, the airfields, the settlements have to be dismantled.
Yes.
Begin said, I don't want to be the first prime minister to dismantle
He did.
a settlement. But he did. Why? Because of the law.
No, it's because of peace.
It was not international law. The law had nothing to do with anything. It was a
Mr.
negotiation between
Morris,
two
Mr.
states.
Morris,
Each of which wanted certain things.
Palestinians
The law
wanted,
had nothing to do
as I
with
said
anything.
repeatedly in the
You're not listening.
negotiations.
You're not listening.
I know.
You're missing my
I've
point.
read the negotiations.
The law
There are
has nothing to do with
two
anything.
foreign relations of U.S. volumes on it.
Nobody cared about the law.
The Palestinians kept saying, we want
Because the
exactly.
Palestinians, they weren't there.
Allow me to finish. The Palestinians kept saying, we want what Egypt got. We want what Egypt got.
Yeah.
Egypt got everything
But
back.
nothing to do with the law.
Okay.
Nothing to do
And
with
number two, I'm not saying it's the whole picture, But as Foreign Minister Moshe Dayan said at the time, he said, if a car has 4 wheels and you remove one wheel, the car can't move. And for them, removing Egypt from the Arab front would then remove any Arab military threat to Israel. So the first part did. And that's what the Palestinians kept saying. We want what Egypt got from the
that's true, but forget international law.
And by the way, one last thing, on a personal note. The quote about Sharm el-Sheikh without peace, okay, that's the only thing you ever cited from a book of mine. Yes. I was absolutely shocked at your betrayal of your people. That was pure treason. It was
I apologize for that. I apologize.
All right, well, let me try once again. For the region and for just entirety of humanity, what gives you hope? We just heard a lot of pessimistic, cynical takes. What gives you hope?
Like war. That's a good reason. That's hope. In other words, the fear of war, the disaster of war, should give people an impetus to try and seek peace.
When you look at people in Gaza, people in the West Bank, people in Israel,
They should want-
fundamentally they hate war.
Yes, I think so.
What gives you hope?
There's no hope, no. It's an extreme, no, I'm not happy to say that.
Of course you are.
It's a very bleak moment right now. Because
That I agree with.
Israel believes it has to restore what it calls its deterrence capability. I think you've written about it, actually. I just realized. Israel has to restore its deterrence capability. And after the catastrophe of October 7th, restoring its deterrence capacity means, this part you didn't write about, the annihilation of Gaza and then moving on to the Hezbollah.
No.
So the Israelis are dead set on restoring that deterrence capability. On the Arab side, and I know Mouin and I have disagreed on it, and we're allowed to disagree, I think the Arab side, the lesson they learned from October 7th is Israelis aren't as strong as we thought they were. And
that could be an unfortunate message. That's really what the
and
Arabs
they think that there is a military option now. And I think that's a zero-sum game at this point, and it's very, very bleak. And I'm not going to lie about that. Now, I will admit my predictive capacities are not perfect, are limited.
Yes.
But for the moment, it's a very bleak situation.
That I agree.
And I don't see right now a way out. However, at the very minimum, permanent ceasefire and inhuman and illegal blockade of Gaza. And
why is it illegal? They were shooting rockets at Israel for 20 years. Why is that illegal to blockade Gaza?
Why is it illegal? I'll tell you why.
You don't rocket your neighbor. Expect consequences.
I'll tell you why.
Expect consequences.
But that works both ways.
I know,
Professor Morris, I'll tell you why. Because every human rights, humanitarian, and UN organization in the world has said that the blockade is a form of collective punishment, which is illegal under international law. You think a blockade?
You don't understand the way the world works.
And you think confining, because that's the blockade.
Yes, you don't.
Confining a million children.
That's the choice of Hamas.
Combining
That's
a
Hamas'
million
choice.
children in what the economists called a human rubbish heap.
The economists supported Israel in this war and continue to support Israel.
What International Committee of the Red Cross called a sinking ship, what the UN High Commissioner for Human Rights called a toxic slum. You think you think under international law, you think it's legitimate to hey, I know you want to forget the law. It's the one thing that it's what every Israeli fears the most. The law. As Zippy Whitney said, I studied international law, I oppose international law. Of course you don't want to hear about the law. Okay, so here's the thing. Then don't complain about October 7th. If you don't want to say forget about the law, then there is no international humanitarian law. There's no distinction between civil.
I would say the same. If Norman wants to say don't complain about October 7th, then you could say the same thing about Israel's response. Don't complain about the response.
Yeah, exactly.
And combatants.
There should be.
And so now you're doing what Mouin said. You're becoming very selective about the law. If you want to forget about the law, Hamas had every right to do what it did. They had every right to do what it did, according to you, not to me, because you want to forget the law.
Do you still support the Houthis shooting random ships?
Absolutely.
Okay, that's a violation of international law. You play the same games.
Absolutely. And were there a power during World War II who had the courage of the Houthis? Were there a power that had that kind
So
of courage?
courageous to be bombing merchant ships while tens of thousands of people died of actual starvation, not the starvation that exists in the Gaza Strip, where people before October don't die of starvation. That's not the concentration camps that you guys are.
What about starvation in Yemen? Don't they have something
That was the Houthis.
Yes, I know.
That was the Houthis.
Don't
And you know, in 3 years, they lost 180,000 people.
They be feeding the Yemenis?
60,000 Yemenis died of starvation.
Why fight the Western powers in Israel when you should be taking care of your problems at home? The Houthis.
Often, the only allies of the dispossessed are those who experience similar circumstances.
Don't you think that they should take care of the Yemeni problems?
I'm very happy they're helping out the Palestinians. Anyone who helps the people, anybody who comes to the aid of those suffering the genocide, half of whom are children. Yeah, according to the most current UN reports, as of today, 1/4 of the population of Gaza, that means 500,000 children are on the verge of famine.
They keep saying on the verge of. I have not seen one Palestinian die of starvation in these last 4 months.
Well, there have been
They're always on the
documented
verge.
cases.
They're on the verge.
There have been documented cases.
I haven't seen it.
Yesterday, Al Jazeera said 6, and the day before that they said 2. So those are
Okay. That number probably dies in Israel of starvation also.
I don't think there's famine in Israel.
There isn't in the Gaza Strip either. It's something which is produced for the Western.
There are infants dying due to a engineered lack of access to food and
I don't think it's
nutrition.
engineered. I think that the Hamas stopped shooting. Perhaps
Maybe if they were putting more food through the tunnels and less weapons, they might have had food. Maybe if they used those hundreds of millions, if not billions of dollars for food and not tunnels, they would have more food. Maybe if it's okay, I can go on for a while.
Wild idea that you had there.
Right.
Unfortunately,
As you said, engineered.
I think Human Rights Watch called it using starvation as a weapon. That's called engineering.
That's what they did, but you were pushed on this by Coleman Hughes to bring up like an example of why is the Gaza Strip, like by what metric are they starving? By what metric is it so behind the rest of the world?
You know, if we're going to bring up,
Why won't you answer that? 'Cause you didn't
Okay, I'm happy to answer it.
Yeah.
I just called you from the humanitarian organizations. They said 1/4 of the population of Gaza is now verging on famine.
Before October 7th.
Okay,
Before
I'm not
October
going before
7th.
October
That's what you used as a justification for Hamas fighting. You said the conditions were unlivable. They had to
I said to him.
So my question is, what made it unlivable prior to October 7th? What are the metrics that you're using?
There were about 5, 6, or 7 reports issued by UNCTAD, issued by the World Bank, issued by the International Monetary Fund, and they all said that's why.
Why did they say why?
Okay,
Why did they say
that's
that?
why The Economist, not a radical periodical, described Gaza as a human rubbish.
So tell me by what metrics? If you're a historian, if you know all this work, then tell me what
Here's something else.
He's not going to answer again.
I don't think I've avoided any of your questions, except when they breached the threshold of complete imbecility.
Tell me what metric Gaza Strip is
I'm going to answer. You remember what I said a moment ago? I said to Professor Morris, I defer to expertise. I look at what the organizations say. I look at what the United Nations High Commissioner for Human Rights said.
You don't know. You don't know. You don't care. Okay, that's fine.
You know how complicated? Have you ever investigated how complicated is the metric for hunger, starvation, and famine? It is such a complicated metric they figured out. If you asked me to repeat it now, I couldn't do it.
And yet we have human development index where we rank countries, yet we can still measure infant mortality, life expectancy. So yeah, we can measure all of these things.
Wayne, I'm holding out for you here. You still didn't answer the hope question. What gives you a source of hope about the region?
Well, first of all, I would agree with Benny Morris and Norman Finkelstein that the current situation is bleak, and I think it would be unreasonable to expect it to not get even bleaker in the coming weeks and months. And we know this conflict really, it originated in the late 19th century. It's been a more or less active conflict since the 1920s, 1930s, and it has produced a tremendous amount of suffering and regional conflict and geopolitical complications and all of that. But what gives me hope is that throughout their entire ordeal, the Palestinian people have never surrendered. And I believe they never will surrender to overwhelming force and violence. They have taken everything that Israel has thrown at them. They have taken everything that the West has thrown at them. They have taken everything that those who are supposed to be their natural allies have, on occasion, thrown at them. But this is a people that never has, and I believe never will surrender. And at a certain point, I think Israel and its leaders will have to come to the realization that by hook or by crook, these people are going to achieve their inalienable and legitimate national rights, and that is going to be a reality. What do you
mean by that? You mean all of Palestine? Is that what you mean?
No, and
from the river to the sea.
Well, ideally, of course, yes. And what
those are the inalienable rights.
No, what I was saying earlier, and then the discussion got sidetracked, is that I did believe that a two-state settlement, a partition of Palestine along the 1967 boundaries, would have been a reasonable solution, because I think it also would have opened pathways to further.
But now you believe what?
Further nonviolent engagement between Israel and the Palestinians that could create other forms of coexistence in a federal or binational or
what do you think about refugees in regards to that? Do you think there has to be a resettlement of the 5 or 6 million whoever wants to live land?
I think there has to be an explicit acknowledgement of the responsibility and of the rights. I think that in the framework of a two-state settlement, I think a formula would need to be found that does not undermine the foundations of a two-state settlement. And I don't think it would be that difficult, because I suspect that there are probably large numbers of Palestinian refugees who, once their rights are acknowledged, will find it exceptionally distasteful to have to live among the kind of sentiments that we've heard around this table today, to be quite frank. I mean, I was previously unfamiliar with you, and I watched one of your preparation videos. Very disconcerting stuff, I have to say. You were explaining 2 days ago in the discussion about apartheid and how absurd it was, that in your view, Jim Crow was not apartheid. Jim Crow was not apartheid, but Arab states not giving citizenship to Palestinian refugees is apartheid. That's what I meant with my earlier comments about white supremacy.
So my issue, that's create the white supremacy. So hold on, let me respond. Okay? My issue is that I feel like we have jumped on this euphemistic treadmill, and I think that's part of the reason why this conflict will never get solved. Is because on one end you've got people who are now convinced internationally that they're victims of apartheid, genocide, concentration camp conditions, ethnic cleansing, they're forced to live in an open air prison, with all of these things that are stacked against them, all of these terms that are highly specific, that refer to very precise things. And then when
you expect nothing less from someone who doesn't think Jim Crow was apartheid.
I don't know
who does think that Arab states not giving
morally loading. For you, apartheid is when racists do bad things.
No, there's a definition of apartheid.
That's great. But the specific top-down racial domination enacted through top-down like federal legislative policies or whatever means that I don't know if Jim Crow would qualify for apartheid. That doesn't make it any less. Excuse me, Finkelstein. I'm talking right now. Excuse me, Finkelstein. I'm talking to your friend over here. I don't know if it would qualify as the crime of apartheid. Just like if Israel were to literally nuke the.
Well done, dude. Well done.
Yeah, I got tired of it eventually.
Yeah, well done.
Kill too many people. I don't know if that would qualify for the crime.
In your eyes, probably not.
I don't. Well, yeah, but because genocide requires special intent. I think the issue is instead of. I think this conversation actually is emblematic of the entire conversation.
Let me finish answering Benny Morris's question.
Supporting racism. So yeah,
you did. And you are.
Do you think I support Jim Crow laws?
Look, when
the fact that you can't even answer that honestly.
It doesn't matter what.
Say that 800 civilians were killed by Hamas. You said, well, maybe 400 were killed by Israel.
No,
I know the number. Maybe
you
said 400. You co-signed the opinion.
No, I didn't.
Well, wait, how many? I think the word was some. That's what I heard.
Well, you weren't listening.
How many people do you think approximately? If you had to ballpark it, how many do you think were killed by Hamas?
I think it's pretty clear that the majority of civilians that were killed.
51%. Or 90%.
Don't ask me to put a number on something I don't know. First of all, when you say Hamas, do you mean Palestinians or do you mean Hamas specifically?
Palestinian force. I don't want to say Palestinians because I don't think all Palestinian civilians were involved. I was like, Hamas is on whatever.
But that's how this discussion started. You said Hamas, and I began to answer that, and then Benny Morris said actually he means Hamas in addition to jihad and the others. So
of the invading Palestinian force, how many do you think killed civilians versus the IDF? We think of the ballpark, the percentage.
Well, the figures we have are that about a third of the casualties on October 7th were military. About 2/3 were. What's your question?
What percentage of civilians were killed by the invading force?
I think a clear majority, but I can't give you a specific figure.
If you thought it was closer to 51% or 99% were killed by. It's interesting to actually stake out a position.
It's completely based on complete ignorance because we don't know. Professor Morris doesn't know. William Rabani doesn't know.
With absolute certainty that the IDF is targeting and murdering Palestinian children intentionally. You see the double standard?
No, I don't. You see.
That's so.
I know you don't.
You know why?
I know you don't.
I look at the UN report. No, the UN report.
What are you saying?
I said it's true because they've made a determination, despite the fact that they keep saying that there's no hearing on genocide. They've made the determination it's genocide. They've made the determination that Israel's doing all these war crimes and intentionally killing Gaza civilians. And now their point is we can't actually make a determination when it comes to the other side. You know, this is the kind of double standards that you've seen kind of plague this discussion.
He's really getting Finkelstein. You see how heated Finkelstein's getting. You can tell he's really getting to him. He's making
Yeah.
On the Great March of Return in 2018, and they said that the snipers were targeting children, medics, journalists, and disabled people.
Just as they are now. In this conflict,
Exactly.
no, more journalists have been killed in the last several months in Gaza than in any other conflict.
And in all of World War II.
Hamas is not killing journalists in
You
Gaza.
agree they operate in civilian uniforms, that their goal is to induce that confusion, that that's the way that they conduct themselves militarily?
Let me finish my point. More journalists
I understand.
have been, more UN
Children
He doesn't want to hear it. So
No,
boring.
because
It's so
virtue
boring.
signaling. It is virtue signaling.
yeah.
Yes, like we
I
say
know.
children over and over again. That's virtue
Talking about,
signaling.
talking about how many,
you have
talking
this
about how
habit
many
of
Israelis
talking
were killed. That's not virtue signaling, because that's human
I
life.
don't care about it. I don't care.
You just interrogated 51%, and then Muin mentions that more journalists were killed in Gaza than in all of World War II.
Doesn't further any
And
part of
more
the
medics were killed
No,
in
that's
Gaza.
silly.
And then he says it's virtue
in the
signaling.
area.
But when Israelis get killed, that's serious.
It's serious on both sides.
Yeah,
I'm
serious
not
on both
virtue
sides.
signaling. I'm not virtue
Virtue
signaling. I'm
signaling.
asking a substantive question of who do you assign blame to, or do you plan to Norman Finkelstein's conspiracies? That the ambulance, they should have known immediately who was dead. The numbers were changed because they were fake, or that maybe 51% of the people were killed by Hamas and Islamic Jihad, but 59% were killed by IDF helicopters.
You asked me a direct question, and you got a direct answer.
I did. I got a majority, which could be
I said a clear,
51 to 99.
clear majority.
What percent is a clear majority? As opposed
Oh, wait,
to
they live in
Clear
ambiguity.
majority, in my view, is well over 50%. Please don't ask me to be more precise, because
you could say 80, 90, 95.
if I knew that, I would say it.
I think it's reasonable. It's a reasonable.
Perhaps it is, but
You're not the best person to be asking that question. You know, I read when you described Operation Defensive Shield, and you said a few dozen homes were destroyed.
You're talking about what happened in Jenin refugee camp.
And you said-
No, the Arabs
you
said 500. You guys said 500 Palestinians were killed in
No,
Jenin.
no,
And then that was the statement of the PLO, the Palestinian Authority.
You said a few dozen.
And there were massacres there.
A few dozen
Yes, a few
homes.
dozen homes.
Yeah, well, it
That's
turned
right.
out 140 buildings were destroyed. 5,000 people were left homeless.
How many
You
were
described
killed?
5,000.
How many
You
were killed?
described it. No, I'm talking about homes destroyed. So you're not the best person to be criticizing what Muin says when he says clear majority, but he can't say more. You know why he can't say more?
He doesn't-
Doesn't know.
Yeah, I understand that.
I hope as a historian.
if I was trying to belittle, I would give you a very different answer. I would just say, I don't know. I do know
the
that
right
so
phrase,
much.
the right phrase there would be the overwhelming majority were killed by Arab gunmen, and very small number were killed by Israelis by accident or whatever.
You're not
That's
speaking
probably
as a
true.
historian,
That's
no.
probably
That may be,
No,
I can state with confidence a clear majority, overwhelming majority. You may be correct, but I can't state that with certainty. I think there's a very easy way to find out, is to have an independent.
Forget
I'm
independence.
saying,
well, of course you forget
the law.
Forget that doesn't mean
Forget the
anything.
law.
Independence, UN High
Forget
Commission for
independent.
Human Rights,
not
not
necessarily.
Just repeat the
They're
number.
all
Just repeat the
barbaric
spelling
countries.
of-
Syrian was the head of the UN Commission for Human Rights.
But if it was in Israel, it would have been okay.
He certainly would have been more honest than a
Of course.
Syrian.
Oh, yeah, from your perspective.
But to disagree with Stephen, I thought this was extremely valuable. And at times, really, like the view of history, the passion. I'm really grateful that you would spend your really valuable time. And just one more question, since we have two historians here. Well, just briefly, from a history perspective, what do you hope your legacy as historians, Benny and Norm, will be of the work that you've put out there? Maybe Norm, you can go first and try to just say briefly.
I think there's a value to preserving the record. I'm not optimistic about where things are going to end up. There was a very nice book written by a woman named Helen Hunt Jackson at the end of the 19th century, describing what was done to the Native Americans. She called it a century of dishonor, and she described in vivid, poignant detail what was done to the Native Americans. Did it save them? No. Did it help them? Probably not. Did it preserve their memory? Yes. And I think there's a value to that. You know, there was a famous film by Sergei Eisenstein. It was either Battleship Potemkin or Mother. I can't remember which one. The last scene was the Tsar's troops mowing down all the Russian people. He pans the scene.
I mean, there's just no debate here that I would argue that the Jews are much more Native American than the Palestinians are, considering the Palestinians are Arabs and Arabs come from the Arabian Peninsula. But that's another point in of itself.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah, well, he pans the massacre. He pans the massacre.
But he could have killed a lot.
And if you want to go even further, because people like to talk about skin color, I can tell you if a white, blonde, blue-eyed Palestinian has the same exact bloodline as a black Afro-Palestinian, as in comparing Ethiopian Jews to Ashkenazi Jews, like
Yeah.
And the last words of the movie were proletarians, ! Remember, ! And I've seen it as my life's work to preserve the memory and to remember. I didn't expect that anyone would read my book on Gaza. It's very dense. It gives me even a bit of a headache to read at least one of the chapters.
You wrote a book on Gaza?
And but I thought that the memory deserves to be preserved.
Amen.
Well, I would just say very briefly, unlike my colleague, I think writing the truth about what happened in history in various periods of history, if I've done a little bit of that, I'm happy.
Thank you, Norm. Thank you, Benny. Thank you, Stephen. Thank you, Muin. Thanks for listening to this conversation with Norman Finkelstein, Benny Morris, Muin Rabbani, and Stephen Bunnell.
Well, we can wrap it up. We can close it up there. So, any final thoughts?
I mean, I think I said a lot of what I would have closed with. It's probably not worth me repeating. People have heard me say it through the various outputs throughout this. Yeah, at the end of the day, I think Benny Morris, you leave with those words. If I could have contributed a little bit to the truth of the historical record, then I'd be happy. And I think that should be anyone's aim who is at all involved in any sort of conversation regarding this, is that, there are facts and there are things that happened. And sometimes they align with your narrative and with your camp. And sometimes they don't. and it's okay to admit that they don't. You know, Israel is a country like any other country that has done wrongs. It's a question of where do we go from here? And if you want to then look at the historical record, you have to acknowledge that at bottom, the Palestinians have been unwilling to reach any sort of political compromise since the 1930s. And that is something that's going to have to change.
Yeah. So what do you think? Okay, so going forward, obviously, do you think that the Palestinians will ever be able to bring in a new leadership that will be more moderate and in the understanding that they're going to have to be that way in order to actually live alongside us?
It will require a fundamental societal shift before anything like that happens. I explain what I mean, and I think it's always valuable to maybe take things outside the context of Israel and Palestine, just to explain a process. If you look at the American South, 100 years ago, 200 years ago, people were leaving in their Sunday best, in their suits from church, and they would go to a nearby area and they'd watch a public hanging of some innocent black man or woman. That's no longer happening in America. There's a reason why that's no longer happening in America, because there was a period of self-reflection among the American population. What I say is that to deny an issue among a collective society is to deny the very possibility of progress. So what I say is I'm not sure what the outcome would be, or if there even is one. What I can say is that I believe that progress is possible if you acknowledge at bottom what the core issue is. I've always said that the core issue is not an issue of territory, an issue of various things that people say it is. It's two contradicting ideas. The idea that the Jews want a state and the idea that the Palestinians want the Jews to not have that state. The latter will need to change for there to be a peace settlement. I don't think it's impossible, because we've seen this process played out in conflicts between other peoples. We've also seen it play out in other experiences that represent human nature, as what I've just said about the American South. But I think that my primary mission right now is to stick to that. What is at bottom, the core of this issue? Because to deny that in pursuit of some sort of, let's have a nice conversation, let's have what people would like to present as a fair conversation, to avoid the uncomfortability of that absolute truth, and thinking that just, conversing in some sort of a narrative program is going to make progress. In fact, it's an impediment to progress. You have to acknowledge the issue in order to make progress. And right now, as long as people are not acknowledging the issue, which is at bottom that the Palestinians do not want the Jews to have a state in any part of the land, and that all the horrific things, the wars, terrorist organizations, the building of settlements, a military occupation, changing landscapes, terror attacks, wars, violence from settlers in the West Bank, all of these are the outcomes of those two contrasting ideas. So you can speak about an occupation, you can speak about terrorist groups, but all of that is irrelevant because it is the result, the outcome of those two contradicting ideas. My thing for the future is I don't know what the outcome would be. I know what my preferred outcome as someone who doesn't want to live in a constant state of war would be. That would be a peaceful diplomatic settlement. I do not believe that we get there as long as we live in a world in which we're not prepared to admit to ourselves what the problem is. Because just to reiterate, as I've said, to deny the core of an issue is to deny the possibility of progress.
Yeah, that's extremely accurate. All right, I hope there's something that we can do. I hope that both sides can put peace as the priority, make that the priority. And I also think that the more the Arab world comes to accept our sovereignty, and the Palestinians, as you mentioned, realize that continuing to fight us is not going to be in our best interest. And also the Israeli side, the Israeli government, not incentivizing them to believe that furthering the war effort is going to give them more opportunity, thereby denying every potential opportunity for peace, will eventually get them more of what they want. Because at the end of the day, no matter how you spin it, in the ideal scenario, the Palestinians would want the entire thing. And they're going to have to accept that compromise that that's not going to happen. So, yeah, we'll wrap it up there. Ladies and gents, I hope if you made it this far, I hope you enjoyed. This has been another episode of the Soothing Semantics podcast. Make sure to subscribe, like, and share. Go follow me at Rafi the Realtor. Go follow Sam at Samuel Joshua Hyde on Instagram. And make sure to check out all of his incredible work. And make sure to leave your comments. It has been a pleasure. Thank you, dude. Thank you so much for taking so much time. You've taken an enormous amount of time out of your life to sit down with me. And I immensely, immensely appreciate it. Thank you.
I wouldn't have done it with anyone else, but I'll. No,
It's
I'm always open to speaking to people, but I appreciate you having me on. I had a great time in our first episode, so I was more than happy to sit here and do this with you and have a laugh at Finkelstein where we could. So thanks for having me.
Yeah, by the way, you didn't really do too much of the impression.
I just thought I'd let people absorb, his idiocy for his idiocy.
Right.
Yeah.
Fair enough. All right, guys. I will see you on the next episode. Take